Housing affordability takes centre stage. The second from Marion Wilkinson on jobs and climate change. Hope you can join me then. Good night.
This is an historic day.
Prime Minister told Parliament that
Good evening. It's Monday, the 16th of May. Our top stories tonight. Sweden and Finland accelerate efforts to join NATO as Ukrainian troops gain ground in Kharkiv. Kim Jong-un says North Korea is facing great turmoil as COVID threatens the non-vaccinated nation. At least 14 killed after a tourist bus crashes in East Java. And India's heatwave intensifies with parts of New Delhi nearing 50 degrees Celsius. You're watching The World. O'Connor. Also tonight was the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, an act of racially motivated violent extremism. Well, the wheels are in motion tonight for both Finland and Sweden to make an historic change to their neutral status and join the NATO military alliance. Parliaments of both countries are debating the issue today in the face of warnings from the Kremlin that seeking entry into the military alliance would be a grave mistake. Earlier today, the US Senate Republican leader met with the Finnish president and says the two countries could gain membership as quickly as 3 months.
There's never been a more successful military alliance than NATO. Finland brings a lot to the alliance. Frankly, their participation strengthens the alliance significantly, and it's a great honor to happen to be here on the day when your request for admission is official, and I think certainly we hope to achieve it before the August recess when Congress typically goes out of session.
Meantime, Ukrainian forces in the northern city of Kharkiv say they've reached the Russian border in what's been celebrated as a reconquering of territory. Shelling has subsided and some of the surrounding villages that were under Russian occupation are slowly opening up. But as Europe correspondent Steve Kinane reports, residents are now dealing with the devastation left behind.
Malorogan was a peaceful hamlet just 30 kilometres from Russian territory. Full of Russian speakers, it was a village with close links to its northern neighbours. Ties irretrievably destroyed by Putin's brutal invasion. The Russians seized Yulia's house and turned it into an observation post before trashing it on their way out.
They brought grief and destruction. We were living a happy life here. They destroyed everything in a second.
But the Ukrainians fought back, taking trenches, destroying tanks, and wiping out this warehouse that had been commandeered and used to store ammunition. Just like in the battle for Kiev, the Ukrainians drove the Russians out of the villages they'd occupied.
Why did Russians come here? Because they thought they would be welcomed with salt and bread.
Welcome, Russia.
Now the Ukrainian military are helping these communities return to the liberated areas and making sure these villages are now safe.
When you walk down this street, you can see the absolute destruction inflicted on this village by Russian forces. And there's also what you don't see. The local military are telling us that this area, this village, was left booby-trapped and it was left mined. So when civilians came back to their homes, there were bombs inside their electronic equipment, inside their furniture.
The Ukrainians are deeply thankful for the military aid the West has been sending, including the Bushmaster vehicles sent by Australia.
Thank you very much for all Australian people for Bushmasters. It's very nice machine, and my military brothers very cool in Bushmaster and push racism home.
Soon these villages will need a different type of aid when they begin to rebuild these war-ravaged communities. Steve Kinane, ABC News, Malorogan.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has criticised health officials over the slow response to the country's first COVID outbreak that has already infected more than 1 million people. State media has aired footage of the leader visiting pharmacies around Pyongyang as he ordered the military to help with the distribution of medicine. At a Politburo meeting, he blamed the irresponsible work attitude and organisation of the cabinet and public health sector for the spike in cases. Today, nearly 400,000 people were reported to have feverish symptoms. Dozens have died since the outbreak began, but it's unclear how many of these were from COVID. South Korea says it will spare no effort to help the country battle the virus.
우리는 코로나 바이러스의 위협에 노출된
We should provide full support to North Koreans who are exposed to the threat of coronavirus. I have repeatedly expressed my willingness to always open the door to humanitarian aid for North Korea without political or military consideration. If North Korea responds to South Korea's offer to provide aid, we will provide full support, which will include COVID-19 vaccines and medicines, medical equipment and health personnel.
And we'll have more on the situation in Pyongyang with expert Robert Kelly a little later. Well, a tourist bus has ploughed into a billboard on a highway on Indonesia's main island of Java, killing at least 14 people. The bus had been returning to Surabaya from a popular mountain resort when it crashed into a steel pole, injuring 19 others. Victims who survived the crash say the driver appeared to be drowsy while driving at a high speed. Local police are investigating the accident. Well, more details are emerging about the teenage gunman who killed 10 people at a supermarket in New York State. He was taken into custody a year ago after making threats at his high school, but was released after a mental health check. Today he was charged with first-degree murder. North America correspondent Carrington Clark reports from Buffalo.
A day after the horrific attack, the community of Buffalo, New York, is trying to comprehend what they've lost.
We came out here because my little brother's birthday was yesterday. He was turning 3 years old. My dad came to the store to grab him a birthday cake, and he cashed out, but he never made it out the store. And now our life will never be the same again.
He was one of 10 people killed when an 18-year-old opened fire in a supermarket, live streaming it on social media. It's been revealed a day before the attack, the white teenager drove to Buffalo from his home several hours away to do reconnaissance. Police say they're in no doubt the attack on the largely black neighbourhood was an act of racially motivated violent extremism.
Father, we need you. We must all work together to address the hate that remains a stain on the soul of America.
A year ago, the gunman was taken by police to hospital after threatening to carry out a shooting at his high school. He was given a mental health evaluation and then released shortly after. The police are continuing to gather evidence at the crime scene here. Part of the investigation is focused on the suspect's online behaviour. This tragic incident is once again raising questions about whether the tech giants are doing enough to combat hate speech.
I want them to sit in a room, look me in the eye and tell me, have you done everything humanly possible to make sure that you are monitoring this content the second it hits your platform?
This tight-knit community has only just begun dealing with the devastating consequences of being the target of a hate-filled teenager with a gun. Carrington Clark, ABC News, Buffalo, New York.
Northern India continues to suffer from an intense heat wave, with temperatures hitting a record 49.2 degrees Celsius in the capital. Officials are warning citizens to take precautions as the extreme weather is set to continue. For many labourers, though, who have no choice but to continue to work outdoors, it's a struggle to survive.
Here in the northern city of Noida, on the outskirts of New Delhi, workers are contending with an unprecedented heat wave and record high temperatures.
There are so many issues. Our work efficiency is decreased because of the high temperatures. Our contractors often scold us because of this. And if we don't work, what will we eat?
29-year-old Yogendra Tundre and his wife are among many exhausted labourers struggling to cope amid consecutive days of temperatures in the high 30s to mid 40s. Some parts of the capital have reached nearly 50 degrees Celsius.
Because of the heat, sometimes I don't go to work. I take days off. Many times I fall sick from dehydration and then require intravenous fluids.
India suffered its hottest March in more than 100 years, and the current heatwave is the fifth to hit New Delhi since March. It's not just India being impacted. Experts say more than 1 billion people here and in neighbouring Pakistan are in some way at risk from the extreme heat. More than 24 people have died of suspected heat strokes over the past couple of months, a number that has been increasing in recent years. Government data collected over the past 2 decades shows that heat stress is the most common cause of death after lightning from forces of nature. To keep cool, there's also been an increase in the demand for power, leading to outages in some states and compounding the problems for many families.
It's very hot. How can one live peacefully? There's no rest here. It's only pain and misery.
Scientists say while atmospheric factors have led to the current heat wave, global warming is also linked to the longer, more intense and frequent heat waves the country is experiencing. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
Well, let's return to the war in Ukraine, where Russia's aggression has pushed Sweden to follow Finland in declaring its intent to join the NATO alliance. Sweden's ruling Social Democratic Party will back a bid to end more than 200 years of military non-alignment, just days after Finland's formally announced its intention to do the same. Let's go to international politics professor at the University of Birmingham, David Dunn. David, good to talk again. 2 centuries of neutrality that's about to end. How big a step is this for Sweden and Finland?
This is a momentous act on both nations. They have long histories of neutrality. They have had a studied policy of non-alignment, and they have relied on neutrality and international law. The invasion of Ukraine shows that you can't rely on neutrality and international law. Moldova also has been threatened. No one knows what Putin will do next, not necessarily in the short term, but in the long term. And therefore, this has resulted in a fundamental change in policy on the part of Finland and Sweden. And indeed, there seems to be the implications of the Russian actions are that actually there's no room for neutrality or little room for neutrality in Europe.
Yes. And in fact, Russia's stated intention, or Putin's stated intention, was to hold NATO at bay. This would be bringing NATO closer to Russia's borders than ever.
Absolutely. I mean, this fundamentally changes the geography of Europe. Because previously there was this buffer of neutral states between Russia and NATO. This creates an 810-mile addition to the border between NATO states and the Russian Federation. So you're right, the calculation was that he said that he was concerned about NATO expansion and encroachment. Well, actually, the consequence of his aggression are that NATO has united, has grown in confidence and response, and also it seems will grow in numbers as a consequence of his actions.
So when you talk about things changing geographically, how do things change militarily with a step like this?
Well, actually, in terms of the defence of Europe, in particular the Baltic states, the addition of Sweden and Finland are a net advantage to NATO. They're heavily armed countries with conscription, well-resourced armed forces, very capable armed forces, and therefore they make a material contribution to the potential defence of the Baltic states. So their contribution is one which is welcome across the board. But it's politically that their impact is more widely felt. And NATO grows in strength, it grows in stature, and it sends a signal to Moscow that actually its actions, far from weakening NATO and pushing on a weak and divided West, have actually united and strengthened the West response to his actions.
Yes. OK, let's talk about how soon they could be able to join. We heard from Mitch McConnell earlier in the program that they would be hoping to potentially get this done by the August recess in terms of the US political calendar. That would seem very fast.
Historically, these have taken much longer, but these are unprecedented times, and there's a willingness on the part of NATO, and indeed most, if not all, NATO states to actually do this as quickly as possible, recognising that we are at a period of exceptional peril in European security, in that Russia is flagrantly breaking all the pre-existing rules of international relations. So it's likely that this will be done very quickly. It requires every state to ratify that. The Germans are very keen to be the first, given that their position in Europe. The Turks have suggested that they're not entirely happy, but the indications are that's about bargaining for some concessions that the Turks want from NATO on other issues, and therefore it won't be an obstacle. So we can expect this to be done in short order.
And so, yes, Turkey had sort of given a sense that they may stand in the way, but do you feel that that's not going to be the case?
The indications are that it's bargaining rather than a principled response.
Indeed.
But it may also be the case that Turkey wants to actually appear to be slightly more neutral, given that they have a rather unusual relationship with both NATO and Russia.
Indeed. So let's come to Russia. How might Russia respond? It's not going to calm Putin's sense of an existential threat.
No, indeed. In fact, on the specifics of that, the Russians have indicated that they regard both Sweden and Finland's moves as aggressive, and they have said that Russia will respond with a military technical response and retaliation, and that will constitute rebalancing. So it's likely that they will deploy nuclear weapons on the Finnish border as a symbolic response to that action.
Yeah, that is interesting. You know, the war continues. It does seem, though, as if, you know, we're seeing Ukraine in many ways gaining an upper hand at the moment.
Yes, it's clear that the Russian forces that we all thought we knew are proven to be a paper tiger. They're badly led, they are badly organised, they perform very badly, and their losses are considerable. So the Ukraine does seem to be regaining territory and certainly holding the Russians at bay. The Russians, in fact, are changing their tactics and consolidating what they're doing in the limited areas in the Luhansk region, rather than actually going beyond that, because they recognise their inability to carry through on their initial plans.
David, appreciate your time as always. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Meantime, McDonald's has announced it'll sell its 850 restaurants in Russia, becoming the latest international company to end its operations there after the invasion of Ukraine. The fast food giant temporarily closed its stores in early March, but it now says it'll seek a local buyer to employ the company's 62,000 workers in the country. The Chicago-based corporation said continuing business in Russia is no longer tenable nor consistent with McDonald's values. Well, after more than 5 weeks of campaigning, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese are going head-to-head on the issue of first home buyers. What the coalition calls its game-changer idea to let people dip into their superannuation has become a red-line issue for Labor, which warns it's a threat to the nation's retirement savings system. Both parties are offering some form of assistance, but each risks pushing house prices even higher. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Scott Morrison's re-election gamble on bricks and mortar.
Getting the deposit is the hardest part.
The Prime Minister promoting his plan to allow first home buyers early access to their superannuation.
So they don't have to stand on the curb and watch house prices run away from them.
Scott Morrison will bulldoze your super and push up house prices.
Oh my God! Oh!
In an election campaign of relatively few policy contests,
See that second slip?
the battle over housing is as hot as the property market's been. The coalition scheme would see first home buyers dip into their superannuation, capped at 40% or $50,000. Labor's policy would see the government take an equity stake in the home of low and modest income earners, also capped at 40%. But when the property is sold, the contribution plus a share of any capital gain would either go back into super or back to the government.
It's your money and it should be your home. But the master planning on this development.
Both schemes would require a deposit, 5% under the Coalition, 2% under Labor.
I know the benefit of a secure roof over your head. It's my life.
But both policies run the risk of inflating house prices, a minister admitting as much about the Coalition's proposal.
I would imagine in the short term you might see a bump in house prices.
Minister Hume belled the cat this morning.
When you look at the proportion of first home buyers of the entire real estate market, it's quite marginal.
The rival housing policies highlighting the ideological split over superannuation.
This is an attack on future savings. It's an attack on future generations.
What could possibly be wrong with letting Australians use their own savings to buy the most important asset they will ever own in their lives?
Labor's been so keen to keep the focus on Scott Morrison, it's matched many coalition policies over the past few weeks. By drawing the line on super for housing, Anthony Albanese gives his opponent the fight he so clearly wants. The PM says it's about individual choice and aspiration. For Labor, it's about defending a totemic economic policy, a philosophical scrap that'll be decided in 5 days. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
And the Prime Minister has refused to be drawn on whether he'll quit as leader of the Liberal Party if he loses this Saturday's federal election. Speaking to 7:30's Lee Sales, Scott Morrison said he is not thinking about whether he'd step down as leader in the event of a defeat or a hung parliament.
But you must be Prime Minister thinking about what happens if you lose. Can we take it as a given that you would be standing down in that scenario? No, we can't take it as a given.
That is not something I'm contemplating, because I'm not contemplating on that being the scenario.
OK, what if there was a hung parliament, Prime Minister? Prime Minister.
I'm not getting into the scenario games, Lee, because right now I'm focused on one thing. I'm focused on one thing, and that's ensuring that our government continues, because we have the economic plan that we've demonstrated the economic credibility with over these last very difficult years, to ensure we secure the opportunities in the future.
But if you want that
that's what I'm focused on.
If you want that government to continue, let's say...
Then we need to win the majority of seats at this election.
Well, exactly, and what that might involve in the eventuality of a hung parliament is negotiating with independents and minor parties. Would you be prepared to stand aside to give a new leader a fresh slate and chance to negotiate with those people to keep the coalition in government?
No, I'm not speculating on these scenarios, Lee, because my scenario, the scenario that my team is working for, is not to have a weakened parliament, not to have a government that has to negotiate for its existence every day. If I had to do that, Lee, over the last 3 years, Australia would not be in the stronger position we are today.
Well, let's return to the news that more than 1 million people in North Korea have been infected with what the country is calling a fever, days after its leader admitted that it was struggling with a COVID outbreak. Kim Jong-un has also blasted health officials over slow medicine deliveries and ordered the military to step in. Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Busan University in South Korea, says desperation is making the secretive state speak out about the outbreak.
Yeah, I think it probably was. The North Koreans are not particularly good with sharing information. I don't think that surprises really anybody at this point. The North Koreans have lied about lots and lots of things over many, many years, usually about sort of weapons programs. That's the kind of stuff that you and I have discussed before. But I don't think it surprises anybody really that the North Koreans have been, very duplicitous about this. My guess is the reason why they're coming forward now is because it's so bad that they're pretty desperate. North Korea. This is the kind of thing that North Korea usually doesn't tell us, right? Because it wants to sort of present this kind of front that things are sort of great. And I have the feeling that if they're breaking that front, it's because things have gotten really bad.
Yeah. To your point, they have this big front. They don't like accepting help. Do you think at this point they're actually needing help from the outside?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, at this point, I think their alternatives are to either do what the Chinese are doing, right, which is to sort of lock down all of their cities, which, as we know from China, has been very, very stressful, right? Everybody's seen these videos of people like banging pots out windows and stuff like that. There's enormous unhappiness in China over this. So it's either that or accept vaccines, or I suppose just let it go. If you do that, you're talking, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of people are going to die. So I don't know if the regime's going to consider that, but But their remedial alternative is either a severe lockdown or aid, because they cannot generate what they need internally. That's very obvious.
Yeah, but I can't imagine, you know, China is a country well set up with networks to deliver food, etc. I can't imagine North Korea is set up well for a lockdown.
Right, sure. Yeah, that's right. I mean, it would be pretty difficult. Well, the lockdown might actually be possible. I mean, I suppose the North Koreans could sort of send the military into something like that. But even that, I think, would be troublesome, right? Because North Korea is actually not governed particularly well outside of the capital city, which is something we don't talk about very much. But North Korea is actually kind of a failed state. Once you leave its cities, it basically doesn't really operate very well. I think the real issue, though, I think, is medical aid and distribution, right? Where I think you're absolutely correct that the North Koreans just do not have the grassroots hospital system. They don't have the medical system prepared to distribute anything remotely like the PPE, the masks, the vaccines, and the rest of it that we all struggle with in the outside world, right? I mean, it even took the wealthy countries in the world fully, 6 months, 8 months to get on top of this to really get the process of protection rolling. And in North Korea, you can only imagine how much worse it will be.
Yeah. What sort of, if any, vaccination program have they got in place and testing?
So far as I know, none. The North Korean approach to this thing was basically to prevent all incoming traffic, right? Which is actually, in North Korea's case, somewhat feasible to do. North Korea is already really heavily sanctioned. It doesn't trade a great deal. A lot of what it does is illicit, which isn't affected sort of either way. And so actually, sealing off the entire country from the whole world isn't that difficult insofar as North Korea is an Orwellian state that's already kind of done that. It sounds really horrible to say, but I mean, that's the way North Korea is governed. So it's actually not that difficult as a policy step. But as we all know, I think as the rest of the world has sort of figured out, right? I mean, COVID is just super transmissible, right? And it's sort of only a matter of time, I suppose, that this sort of broke through. I have to say I'm rather impressed, actually, that North Korea managed to ride out the first 2 years of this thing without an explosion. But, I mean, I know I'm not a biologist, but I mean, my sense is that everybody kind of thought that, this thing was eventually going to seep through. And it's pretty shocking the North Koreans didn't do any prep time, right? I mean, they bought themselves 2 years with this brutal sealing off, and now they've still got nothing. And they didn't, South Korea's offered, I'm in South Korea, we've offered them lots of vaccines for free, and they turned them down.
Yeah, they've turned down vaccines from a number of countries. But it is interesting because there is a new regime in South Korea, a new government, I should say, a new president. How could this be an opportunity to try and improve relations between the two?
Sure. And this kind of stuff has come up in the past. I mean, when North Korea had this terrible famine 25 years ago, those were another opportunity to build, I don't know, sort of demand-driven, non-ideological bridges, which is to say, rather than sort of trying to have like some big discussion about like changing North Korea, instead you can say, look, here's a need, we can help you, and that creates some room for sort of technocratic or non-political interaction. But North Korea has traditionally actually sort of cracked down on that kind of stuff. Even aid, the North Koreans often reject for political purposes because they see aid as sort of insulting to their national dignity and things like that. And like you mentioned, I mean, we've offered vaccines to the outside world before, and they've turned it down. So, I don't know. I think honestly, it's kind of a 50-50 that they'll take it. My sense is sort of like what you were saying before, is that it may be so bad that they feel compelled to do it because, I mean, they can't control COVID, right? And the regime elites are going to get it too, right? I mean, lots of Western leaders and stuff like that have contracted it. So, and if you're Kim and the cronies, you're probably pretty scared, which is actually rare in North Korea, right? I mean, normally the North Korean elites can keep bad stuff in the population, but now they're under threat because this thing is basically uncontrollable.
Yeah. Kim Jong-un is raging against his cabinet and others in government. Do you think there could be some retribution, people to blame for this outbreak?
I do think so. North Korea is sort of designed along the system of the good czar, if you will, where the guy at the top, the sort of the great sun king at the top, is not to blame, right? And the underlings, sort of get the punishment when things go wrong. And so the North Korean elite, I presume Kim Jong-un will punish some members of the North Korean elite if this thing gets really bad. As we have discussed, there may be some exiles, maybe even executions if it gets really out of control. Kim, of course, will take no blame for himself. I think that's pretty clear.
And just back to the new South Korean president, he had talked quite tough against the North in the lead up to the election. How do you see the relationships changing here?
So the previous president, the guy who just left, was a real dove on North Korea, which is to say he wanted engagement and he wanted to discuss nuclear weapons a lot with North Korea and sort of build all kinds of inter-Korean bridges and stuff like that. But that the rest of the world, including Australia, I might add, but the West generally wanted some kind of movement from North Korea on nuclear missiles, particularly, right? I mean, the rest of the world is genuinely scared of North Korea's growing missile and nuclear program, and the old South Korean government didn't really want to forward that issue or center that issue. This Korean government is much more sort of in step with countries like the US and Japan, Australia, and others who really want some kind of progress, but want that to come with a deal on nukes and missiles. And so I think that's what you're going to see. I think relations, particularly with the United States, will be easier now than they were before. But this president isn't really super hawkish. I don't think it's going to be like 2017 fire and fury again. I don't think we're going to do that. But he will support sanctions a little bit more strongly than the previous president.
Great to talk as always, Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Queen Elizabeth has attended the finale of a 4-day horse show that drew a star-studded cast, including Hollywood actor Tom Cruise. The 96-year-old monarch was driven to the outdoor spectacle, which kicked off celebrations to mark her 70 years on the throne. The Queen has been seen in public only on a few occasions since spending a night in hospital last October for an unspecified illness. She's attended every Royal Windsor horse show since its inception 79 years ago. Well, the first total lunar eclipse of the year has wowed onlookers around the world. The blood moon occurs when the moon passes through the Earth's shadow, giving it an unmistakable red glow. But in a rare lunar event, the eclipse coincided with a supermoon. Now, that is when the moon is at its closest point to Earth, making it appear larger than usual. Australia sadly missed out on the spectacle. This time, astronomers say a blood moon will occur above Australia in early November. Our top stories tonight on the world. Russian troops forced to retreat from Ukraine's second-largest city, Kharkiv, as its eastern offensive stalls. COVID is likely to spread rapidly across North Korea, according to the WHO, as the unvaccinated country battles its first outbreak. And no respite for India, with parts of New Delhi reaching nearly 50 degrees Celsius as its heat wave continues. Well, NATO says it is confident Turkey won't delay the membership of Finland and Sweden to the military alliance. Foreign ministers from NATO's 30 member states have been holding informal talks in Germany as the two Nordic countries took firm steps to join. Turkey has accused Sweden and Finland of supporting Kurdish militant groups on their territory, but the NATO Secretary-General says he's confident they'll be able to reach a consensus.
Turkey has made it clear that their intention is not to block membership, and therefore I'm confident that we will be able to address the concerns that Turkey has expressed in a way that doesn't delay the membership or the accession process.
Moscow has threatened retaliation if NATO weapons are deployed close to Russia in Finland. Well, the Prime Minister has denied he broke an agreement with the Biden administration in the US by deciding to delay briefing Labor on the AUKUS alliance. The United States insisted on bipartisan support for the new security alliance with Australia and the UK before it could be finalised. Scott Morrison says Labor wasn't consulted until the day before the pact was announced, suggesting the deal may have leaked if Labor MPs were briefed earlier.
I mean, you've got the deputy leader of the Labor Party who would have been sitting in such a briefing, who had, frequent flyer points for visiting the Chinese embassy in Australia. I mean, seriously, this was one of the most secure and highly confidential agreements the Australian government had entered into since ANZUS.
Well, let's return to the mass shooting in the American city of Buffalo, where a white gunman killed 10 people. Most of the victims were black. Authorities say they're investigating the shooting as a hate crime and racially motivated violent extremism. Dr. Ben Rich is the co-director of the Curtin Extremism Research Network and says this form of attack has been on the rise in recent years.
Well, we've seen over essentially since the election of Donald Trump, a number of attacks in places like El Paso, motivated by a racial accelerationist ideology. So these are a group of people largely concentrated or centred on various communities on the internet who feel that a society is barreling towards a race war. Based around conditions we see in the West, whether that's in the United States, whether that's in Australia, whether that's in Europe. And they see themselves as part of an accelerationist collection of individuals who are basically pouring gas on the fire with the goal of sparking off something far more large and challenging to the security environment.
Yeah. You talk about since the election of Donald Trump, has the divisiveness of politics in the United States played into this?
Definitely. I mean, I think we've seen across the spectrum things that were once considered to be extremely on the periphery of society have become mainstream platforms. Obviously, one of the most glaring examples of this is Fox News in the United States, part of the Murdoch media empire, pushing the Great Replacement theory on shows like Tucker Carlson. This is a theory that started, on the extreme fringes and sort of the dark corners of the internet, and is now very much talked about in large segments of, mainstream right-wing media.
And this is the fact that people of European descent will be replaced by minorities, blacks, Jews, and the list goes on. He was only 18. Are younger people more susceptible to this kind of rhetoric, or is it right across the board?
Well, I think the youth factor is a big part of this. I think we've seen this speed up since COVID. We know that this individual found himself, on particular web forums where these ideas were sort of front and center, particularly during the COVID lockdowns, when he was kind of searching for meaning, searching for explanations. And that really sort of sent him down this rabbit hole. And now we see, an entire generation who are brought up in this very much digital space, coming into conditions of sort of economic disparity, uncertain future. They're looking for answers. And these groups are oftentimes, and these movements are positioned to kind of give them those answers in many instances.
He had done quite a lot of research around events like the massacre in Christchurch in New Zealand and also the Norwegian massacre. Do these kind of events sort of prompt that kind of mass copycat attack?
Well, his manifesto is directly copies and pastes the Christchurch manifesto. So there's definitely a sort of a memification, a replication of symbols, ideas. We know he also daubed his weapon in symbols that relate to racial extremism. He put shout-outs to former individuals who engaged in these types of attacks in the past. So they're definitely building on each other. They're seeking to inspire themselves. They're seeking to inspire other attackers. And we can see a direct link between particularly this attack and the Christchurch attack.
He'd entered the mental health system a year ago, but then seemed to slip out of the authorities' attention. Is the system robust enough to detect these kind of cases? What needs to change to try and sort of help these people?
Well, I think the mental health side of things is important. Obviously, I haven't seen his profile, I haven't seen the particular file, so I can't comment directly on that. But I think this also speaks to the need for a more whole-of-society approach and response to this. So we don't just, for instance, handball it off to mental health officers or police officers to deal with this. This was an individual, as far as we can tell, who had gone through a period of isolation, wider social alienation, and had kind of slipped between the cracks. And we need to have wider social responses to this to be able to identify these types of issues. But we aren't just relying on, for instance, psychologists and police officers. We need to have the skills and tools in the wider society that can pick up on this and try and stop these kind of individuals getting pulled in and sucked into these very malevolent groups and ideologies.
Is this an issue that you're seeing outside of the United States?
Definitely. I mean, we have it here in Australia. Obviously, it's not as bad for a number of reasons. But we're seeing in over in Europe. Obviously, you mentioned the Norway attacker from 2013. So we've seen a sort of a series of events around this. Obviously, ones of sort of the larger scale, the mass shooting ones, tend to be rarer. But given the conditions that we're seeing, we will likely see more and more of these over the coming years. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to prepare ourselves as a society for that, to not overreact to that, but to also figure out ways and means that, again, as a whole of society, we start to try and address the conditions that lead to these people getting radicalised. There's always going to be the irredeemables. There's always going to be the ones that are the true believers. But for every one of those, there's going to be 10 who have slipped into these groups because of other conditions in their lives. And we need to be able to kind of try and give them a positive message to step away from that so we can prevent these types of things from happening. They're never going to fully be stopped, but we can definitely lower their likelihood significantly.
You know, and what you do see whenever there are discussions around the Black Lives Matter culture in the United States, or in any way trying to sort of balance the disparity there's been between black and white in America over the generations, politics divides it. Politics sort of plays it up, which, you know, until we see that stop, is this going to be a problem?
Well, I think political polarisation, which you're alluding to there, is a major problem here. And we're seeing that, you know, again, in the United States, you know, the extremes of politics now seem to be the norm over there. The ability to reach across the aisle and come together around issues, the ability to have even just a shared reality. And certainly we have that here to an extent in Australia, although I would say it's to a much lesser degree. But I think we can look to the United States as an example of what not to do, and perhaps try and steer away from that before we end up, you know, in the same kind of position. You know, we here in Australia tend to take a lot of lead from the United States. The United States is often kind of out ahead of us, and I think we can look over there what's happening now and perhaps try and put resources, put community effort back into trying to sort of right the ship, as it were, here at home, and then hopefully they can also be doing that over there.
Ben, good to get your insights on this. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
A former Somali president voted out of power in 2017 has been re-elected to the top job. The election of Hassan Sheikh Mohamud brings to an end a protracted process that saw several former leaders vie for the position. Hassan served as Somalia's president from 2012 to 2017. Celebratory gunfire ran out in parts of the capital, Mogadishu, when the result was announced. Australian followers of a movement founded by a fugitive Chinese billionaire have been discovered censoring critics on a free speech social media platform. An ABC investigation can reveal how supporters of controversial businessman Guo Wengui are secretly monitoring dissenters on a Twitter-like app which claims more than 4 million users. Ariel Bogle has this special report.
Let's say you're looking around in a particular corner of the internet and you're no fan of the Chinese government. You might quite easily fall under the spell of this man, Guo Wengui. Guo Wengui has been living in exile from China since 2014. He is said to be a former real estate mogul and a billionaire, a thorn in the side of the Chinese government, and a man who has threatened to expose high-level Communist Party figures. Along with former Trump advisor Steve Bannon, he's launched his own media channels and a political movement, the new federal state of China.
Take down CCP! Take down CCP! So great. Thank you, Miles. Thank you.
They claim their movement will one day replace China's government. And Guo says that when it does, a new cryptocurrency called Himalaya coin will replace the Chinese currency. The only problem is that this so-called new currency has a lot of red flags. First off, Guo Wengui claims this cryptocurrency is worth tens of billions of dollars. This would put H-coin among the top cryptocurrencies in the world, which experts say is hard to prove. We know Guo promotes the coin, but we don't know if he owns any himself. But he did file for bankruptcy in the United States earlier this year and claimed he has less than $100,000 worth of assets. And in the US last year, a review of other investment schemes that Guo's movement has promoted resulted in a settlement worth more than $500 million. While Guo has amassed a following worldwide, he has forged close relationships with several former members of Donald Trump's administration, and his followers have spread a range of far-out messages on social media, including conspiracies surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. Here he is speaking with Trump's former trade advisor, Peter Navarro, as well as Steve Bannon and Jason Miller, a former Trump spokesman. Miller now runs the platform Getter, which bills itself as a free speech alternative platform to Twitter.
When will the United States officially recognize new federal state of China? Thank you.
I think it definitely would have to be sometime after 2024 when Trump takes the White House back.
Himalaya coin, or H-coin, isn't like many cryptocurrencies that you might have heard of. It can only be bought and sold on its own special trading platform, Himalaya Exchange, and claims to have reached a market value of $43 billion. This claim is completely unverifiable, and who would believe it? Unfortunately, many people, and that's because of the way Guo's movement promotes his propaganda.
I spent a lot of time, I lost a lot of time to follow him.
Mr. Chiu was in a chat group with core Australian followers of Guo Wengwei.
Many persons in Australia trust Guo Wengwei 100%.
Under the banner of the new federal state of China, dozens of branches called Himalaya farms were established around the world. We've obtained chat logs from the messaging app Discord, where followers in multiple Himalaya farms organised to spread COVID-19 disinformation and pro-Trump messages during the pandemic. Within the Discord chats, we can see followers being instructed to like, follow and repost certain social media accounts to give them a boost. Followers are also organising to try and have posts critical of their movement or their leaders removed from Getter, which calls itself a free speech app. We spoke to one former follower, Lisa, who just a year ago was fully immersed in these forums. She would only speak to us anonymously, given she has fears for her safety ever since she began speaking up against the movement.
Yeah, a bit afraid, to be honest. To me, I think they're brainwashed, totally brainwashed.
真是兄弟姐妹们，咋说呢？你们太有福了，无苗有币。
Lisa says Guo painted a terrifying picture of COVID-19 and the Chinese government to further his agenda.
Disinformation will frighten people. A lot of information frightens people. When people are frightened, they will easily be cheated.
Lisa says she sent almost $20,000 to overseas bank accounts in the United States and the Bahamas in an attempt to buy H-Coin. But then she started to spot red flags, like the fact H-Coin could only be traded in one place, unlike most other cryptocurrencies. But when she raised her concerns to Himalaya Exchange and the other Australian followers of Guo, she says she was labelled a CCP agent and lost access to Himalaya Exchange.
I think it's totally a scam.
Himalaya Exchange says all refunds have been properly processed. They also say they have no connection to Guo or Bannon. In the end, Lisa emailed her bank, but they said there was nothing they could do.
I just want the Australian bank, I want the banks to protect us.
Eventually, the overseas banks were able to refund some of Lisa's money, but she's worried others won't be so lucky. Lisa isn't the only one who sees the potential risks around H-Coin. Financial investigator Ken Gamble took a look at Himalaya Coin for the ABC.
There was an enormous amount of hype, an enormous amount of extreme promotion, which is another red flag. Normally, the way these operations are set up, they have front people and they have spruikers, people who will promote the site.
Ken also noted the secrecy surrounding the platform where Himalaya Coin is traded, the Himalaya Exchange, especially who owns it.
Sending money into a foreign bank account to invest in any sort of coin is potentially very dangerous and risky.
Even though Guo has declared bankruptcy in the United States and is facing a deluge of lawsuits, he hasn't slowed down just yet.
洗币等到流通、洗支付全做完以后，洗保险、洗金融、洗贷款、洗抵押。
As for Lisa, she hopes one day more followers of Guo will wake up, leave the movement and speak out.
Well, fans and teammates have continued to pay tribute to cricket champion Andrew Symonds after his sudden death yesterday. On the field, he was freakishly gifted, but to the people who knew him off-field, he's been remembered as humble and always willing to lend a hand.
An innings cut short for a hometown hero. A roadside memorial to mark the magic of Andrew Symonds.
It feels like it's just happened in my backyard. He's true blue, isn't he? So, yeah, we'll miss him.
Across the globe, sporting royalty lined up to praise the prodigious talent of the man affectionately known as Roy.
We're just lucky to have had him, play our game because he changed the game a little bit, particularly one-day cricket with his power hitting.
And when you're playing sport, there's good days, there's bad days, but having Roy around almost made it good.
On the Gold Coast, tributes were laid at Bill Pippin Oval, where former Dolphins teammates say he was loved both on and off the field.
He's like the crocodile Dundee version of cricket. You know, he loved his fishing and his hunting, but I guess on the flip side of that, he could just hit a cricket ball and play the game of cricket very well.
In his North Queensland hometown, a spontaneous tribute, Rod's out for Roy, a nod to the local legend who spent much of his retirement claiming catches of a different kind. Yet he still made a point of helping up-and-coming athletes.
If he could fit something in or do something for you, he would do it.
But keen to dismiss any praise for his random yet consistent acts of kindness.
I remember I was in a bad place and he dropped off a couple of mud crabs and some beers.
It was here in Charters Towers where it all began for the elite sportsman who earned a string of accolades on the running track, in the swimming pool and, of course, on the cricket pitch. And while his talent sent him far and wide, he never forgot his North Queensland roots.
Andrew was always generous with his time. If he was asked, he was a guest speaker or guest of honour at a formal dinner occasion, giving of his time for one-on-one interviews with students.
Leaving a legacy that transcended sporting codes, but one that's left the cricketing world hurting again, just months after the deaths of Rod Marsh and Shane Warne.
Maybe the great man in the sky is putting together a cricket team.
Jade Toomey, ABC News, Townsville.
Well, the future of Australian car rally races on tarmac is in doubt after a bombshell decision by Motorsport Australia. The authority is suspending Targa rallies, including Targa High Country, pending an investigation into a series of deadly crashes at the Tasmanian leg of the event.
They're fast, they're exciting, but not without danger. Now Targa rallies hang in the balance as the body in charge reviews the events.
It's pretty disappointing as a competitor, but someone as well who obviously invests a lot of money into it.
A string of fatal crashes at Targa Tasmania, now putting that event and others in Queensland and Victoria on hold. Motorsport Australia, which sanctions and insures the events, suspending permits for rally competitions.
While many competitors acknowledge that motorsport is dangerous, we cannot accept that death is an outcome of competition, as has been suggested to us.
Brisbane driver Tony Seymour was killed at this year's Targa Tasmania. That came despite increased safety standards in the wake of 3 deaths last year.
It's very sad for everyone involved, but you know, the overwhelming response from the group is that the show should go on.
I really hope that if Motorsport Australia can't back the event, that perhaps another company will in the future.
Motorsport Australia is conducting its own investigation into this year's fatal crash and a wider review of tarmac rallies. While that takes place, it says Targa events can still go ahead in a non-competitive touring style, with competitors sticking to local speed limits. Damien McIntyre, ABC News.
After a dismal start to the NRL season, Trent Barrett has stood down as head coach of the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. Barrett resigned last night off the back of the Bulldogs' 10-point loss to Newcastle on the weekend. Under Barrett, the Bulldogs have won just 5 out of 34 games. Despite a massive recruitment drive this season, Canterbury is bottom of the ladder, having won 2 matches after 10 rounds.
Well, it's Trent's decision. I mean, certainly I wasn't going to sack him. It's sad that it's come to this, but I think just the performances and the pressure, and he just got to the feeling that probably he didn't have the solution to what was going wrong.
The Bulldogs plan to appoint an interim coach in the next 24 hours ahead of Friday night's clash against the Tigers. Matilda's captain Sam Kerr has scored 2 goals to help Chelsea beat Man City 3-2 in the FA Cup final at Wembley. Kerr opened the scoring in the 33rd minute in front of a crowd of 49,000. Her Matilda's teammate Hayley Rasso found an equaliser in the 89th minute to send the game into extra time before Kerr scored the match winner.
Sam Kerr goes for goal! Finds the goal! Deflection.
I don't really care how they go in, honestly. I thought the first one I had to make sure it went over the line, and the second one we got lucky, but that's what football's about.
It's the second year in a row the Blues have won both the FA Cup and the Super League title. Let's get a check of the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
Well, heading into tomorrow, more unseasonable rain will move into the Pilbara and push further into the interior. And there is, in fact, a warning of heavy rainfall. A low and trough will approach the southwest. More showers and gusty winds for Tasmania, and a weak trough over southeast Queensland will bring a shower or two there. Otherwise, it should be dry. A chance of showers about Queensland's northeast tropical coast and south of a line from Mackay to Hughenden. Showers in the southeast. In Brisbane, they'll be there in the afternoon. Sunny across New South Wales, apart from a shower or two on the far north coast and also the southwest slopes of the ranges. Sunny, but it will be cooler in Sydney and mostly sunny in Canberra. Scattered showers over Victoria's southwest coast will spread to the rest of the southwest and along the coast in the afternoon. Dry in Melbourne until evening showers. Windy over Tasmania with showers, especially over the west, far south and far north. Snow down to 800 metres, a shower or two for Hobart. In South Australia, a shower or two just about the southern agricultural area, the far northwest. Scattered showers about the Mount Lofty ranges and also the lower southeast, a shower or two on the way for Adelaide. In the west, showers over the southwest land division, goldfields, the southern and coastal Gascoyne and eastern Eucla. Rain and thunderstorms over the northern Gascoyne, Pilbara and interior. Evening showers coming up in Perth. And then in the Territory, an afternoon shower or two over the western Lassiter district, especially near the Western Australian border, but a sunny day for Darwin.
Our top stories tonight. Russian troops forced to retreat from Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, as its eastern offensive stalls. The WHO says COVID is likely to spread rapidly across North Korea as the unvaccinated country battles its first outbreak. And parts of New Delhi reach nearly 50 degrees Celsius as India's heat wave intensifies. And that is your world for this Monday. You can catch the show on iView, and there are more news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. See you tomorrow.
What's empathy training, and have you ever had it?
No, I haven't, Lee.
Can you please stand back a bit? Thank you.
Wasn't it a serious conflict of interest getting involved in any way in that grand process?
It's not just about whether it's within the rules, it's about the way it looks.
Lifting wages will have an impact.
Yeah, but how do you lift wages?
There are 9 ministers for housing in this country. What are they all doing?
1,000 jobs. Address the question.
Now is the time to speak.
7:30, Monday to Thursday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
It's the daily destination for everything election.
It's about Australians and the decisions they're making.
We go beyond the campaign trail.
Good to be out and about.
And speak with all the key players.
You don't believe your own government's commitment.
If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck.
Plus, expert analysis on the seats that could decide the result.
For the latest in your electorate and around the country.
Plenty to
talk about.
Join Greg Jennett and Fran Kelly for afternoon briefing. Weekdays at 4 on ABC News and ABC iView. Tomorrow, our must-see true crime investigation continues.
I just couldn't understand how he ended up dead.
A serial domestic abuser attacks 2 more judges.
It's him. Why haven't you charged him?
And embarks on a campaign of bombings.
The target is the family court building itself.
And a criminal profiler examines another killing linked to the case.
I think he was saying, I want you to suffer.
The Family Court Murders. Tomorrow at 8:30 on ABC TV and ABC iView. Gruen Nation is back.
Separating the ScoMos from the elbows, you can call me Ando, but not Undo.
Cutting through the clutter of election advertising.
To prove he won't be a PM that turns everything into a photo shoot, Elbows appeared in a series of photo shoots. If he loses the election, Tara Cash just found their next model.
Gruen Nation.
Oh, I know what I'm voting for in the Hottest 100!
Wednesday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
The Lost Children of Saudi.
Le había dicho a mi mamá que iba a regresar y nunca regresó, entonces...
Every child is entitled to a mother and a father.
And the fathers who abandoned them.
I had that overwhelming urge and drive to find him.
Searching for answers.
He said when he saw me that I look exactly like him. I understand a lot more in detail the culture of his family and the sheer terror that my father must have felt.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
Why is politics still a race to the bottom?
Young people are disappointed, disenchanted. That does not mean that young people do not care about politics.
I think it is both parties, and I actually think that independents are a symptom rather than a solution in themselves.
It's the countdown to Election Day. David Spears is joined by Kathy McGowan and Peter Harcher with live music from Paul Kelly. Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
I am a 94-year-old and still singing every day. When I come to Australia, I couldn't speak English at all. Not one word. So. The most important thing for me to make me happy is my family, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and my garden. I think working in a garden is always essential for me because I grew up on a farm in Italy. That's why I love it. I think that be around with my grandchildren is the most important thing to my heart, that I love them. I say to the young people, work out what you love to do and do it. I'm Biase Michele. I'm proud to be 94 years young. La dolce vita, the sweet life.
Hello, Yvonne Yong with the top stories on ABC News. After more than 5 weeks of campaigning, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have finally locked themselves into a head-to-head contest for votes, with rival policies for first home buyers front and centre. What the coalition calls its game-changer idea to let people dip into their superannuation has become a red line issue for Labor, which warns it's a threat to the nation's retirement savings system. Whoever wins the election, both are offering some form of assistance, but economists warn neither policy will achieve what's needed most to drive down house prices. Emergency crews are continuing their search for a man feared missing in floodwaters at Ballindine in Queensland. 26-year-old Kieran Wilson was reported missing after failing to make contact with family or friends. His car was found on the side of a road, and it's feared he may have tried to cross through floodwaters. And new details are emerging about the teenage gunman who killed 10 people at a supermarket in New York State. He was taken into custody a year ago after making threats at his high school, but released after a mental health check. He's now charged with first-degree murder. Those are the latest stories. I'm Yvonne Yong. Bye for now.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, the Coalition unveils plans for first home buyers to dip into their super to get on the property ladder. Key crossbenchers spruik the benefits of a hung parliament and lay bare their demands if it comes to post-election horse trading. And millions of voters are turning down their chance to snag a democracy sausage on Saturday by voting ahead of Election Day. So what gives? Joining me on the panel tonight, former leader of the New South Wales Nationals and former New South Wales Deputy Premier, John Barilaro. Good to see you.
Great to be back.
You haven't voted early, have you?
Not yet, no.
Absolutely not. CEO of the McKell Institute, former New South Wales Labor Chief of Staff and Policy Director, Michael Buckland. Good to meet you, Michael.
Good to be here.
In Melbourne tonight, National Affairs columnist at the Australian Financial Review, Jennifer Hewitt. Hi, Jen.
Good evening.
And in Canberra tonight, CEO of the Disability Leadership Institute, Christina Ryan. Always welcome, Christina. Lovely to see you.
So good to be here, Ellen.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. There's been a lot of talk during this election about the prospect of a hung parliament, a situation in which the major parties would be dependent on the crossbench, the independents, to form government. That's due in part to the rise of a large field of independent candidates as well as Greens, and it raises the question of what's up for grabs when it comes to negotiating support from a disparate group of crossbenchers. Well, today we heard some answers on that from a collection of current crossbenchers at the National Press Club.
A very big priority for me as a representative for Warringah is to bring forward the climate change bill and to legislate net zero by 2050.
We've made our position very clear. We won't support a return of this current government. It's time for the government to change.
Openness and transparency of government. Everything the government does, they do so on your coin and for public purpose. There's been too much secrecy that's gone on.
This global accord that the World Health Organization is talking about, this global pandemic accord, we will ensure that that doesn't go ahead. We'll expect a commitment from either side of politics to make sure that is rejected.
Our position during those negotiations would be stop opening up new coal and gas projects. You don't put out the fire while you're pouring petrol on it. So stop opening up new coal and gas projects, absolutely critical.
Communities have had enough and they are emerging, realising that their vote is theirs and it can count, and every vote in the House matters.
We've seen how they do things in China, that lockdown in Shanghai, putting cats and dogs in bags and beating them to death. We cannot surrender the sovereignty of our nation, our medical decisions, to the World Health Organization.
The government is trying to scare people with this whole thing about independents holding the balance of power. That's actually operations normal in the Senate.
We'll come to the cats and dogs of Australia and what risk they're at in a moment. But Jenny, let's start with you. Does a crossbench in a hung parliament actually mean that politics would be done differently in the federal parliament?
Well, not as differently as would be suggested by many of the independents' claims, because in the end, you've still got an assortment of people you've got to get bills through. We have the Senate already, where it is dependent on crossbench legislation or crossbenches passing legislation. In the House, though, what you've got is that, say, for example, the Teal independents. Well, they're talking about climate change and wanting more action on climate change as their primary focus, as well as an integrity commission. Yet the Labor Party is not going to suddenly up its own emissions reductions target that it's gone to the election with. So I don't, even in a hung parliament, let alone one where they don't have the balance of power, I don't think that their influence is going to be nearly as much as is suggested on a national level. They will be able to deliver for their electorates in certain things, no doubt, and that's why they're popular. They're kind of very responsive to their electorates once elected. But I actually don't think they have nearly as much practical impact as people would like to believe.
Yeah, that's interesting, Michael Buckland. I mean, in any horse trading between Labor, your party, and the Greens, I mean, it's tough to imagine the Labor Party saying, OK, we will agree to have no new coal mines or fossil fuel mining in Australia.
I think the leaders of both major parties have been pretty clear on this, that there's not going to be any coalition or anything with any of the minor parties. And it's not like we're there at the point where that's expected anyway. Maybe in Europe, where minor parties are getting to 30% of the vote and they really need to start being negotiated with. But I think at the point, both parties know that they would lose too many of their own voters if they jeopardised or compromised on any of their principles. And so I don't think you will see that. I think what we have seen, though, is no one has had a majority in the upper house since work choices. And I think that's actually served us quite well. It's been a good thing to force any government to have to negotiate with the crossbench. And I'd also say that it's been done reasonably successfully here in New South Wales, where the New South Wales government has been in a minority position now because of some people moving to the crossbench. And apart from crossbenchers being able to put things on the agenda and force a debate about things.
And which is the point Rex Patrick made today, because they're not constrained by their party room.
That's right. And it's a good thing if we are having more than one party putting things on the agenda. We should have a debate. And to be honest, from the sounds of it and what the independents are talking about, they're pushing for a National Integrity Commission. That's something I'm certainly not afraid of, and I think it should be on the agenda. And if it takes some independents to help push it there, then great.
Christina, think about the lower house, though. Do you share concerns about, I mean, as a reformer, as an activist, do you share concerns about, it would be an unwieldy situation to have a hung parliament with crossbenchers having the balance of power?
Not at all. I think, as Michael was just saying,
you know, a real opportunity to get more issues on the agenda of politics instead of it being all the government ramming through its own stuff and, you know, being quite draconian about it. I think we need to think more in terms of where this might take politics in the longer term. Will it actually mean we get into that more issues-based format where politicians are actually talking to their electorates on a constant basis instead of these appalling short campaigns that are really shouty and pretty much about politicians and media and nobody else? You know, perhaps it's going to mix up what politics looks like. And, you know, remember that we've got minority government in places like the ACT. We've had them in Tasmania quite a bit. You know, Michael's just talked about New South Wales. So it's not an uncommon thing in Australia. And I think we need to realise that it's a good idea to have a stretch of views in a chamber, because then it does actually broaden out what people can be discussing, instead of it just being the one party ramming it through. And I think we need to be mindful that we've got a couple of parliaments now that have got a very, very small opposition, and what that can actually mean for democracy. Does it reduce it? Does it actually change it? Or is it about how those parties work and we're relying on the goodwill of the leaders to actually be decent humans, which in politics is a weird concept.
I heard Zali Steggall say today, John Barilaro, that one of her demands, if either party wanted her vote to form government, would be that whatever the secret deal is that's negotiated between a minority Liberal Party and its crucial National Party partners would have to be made public. And that's one of her bugbears, is that we never know when there's a coalition government what that deal is between the Libs and the Nats.
Well, that's not correct, because the reality is that, you know, in a coalition, we go to an election with policies that both parties have signed off on. So whatever the policy announcements by, say, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, then the National Party in agreement. It's rare that there are secret deals, and I led the National Party into the 2019 state election. There was no secret deal or pact between myself.
So how come we can never see the details of it?
Because everyone just assumes it's a formal agreement. I can tell you honestly, there was never a written formal agreement between the Liberal Party and the National Party at a state level in relation to policies or any absolute funding, grants, programs or anything like that. The only agreement we ever have in place is the agreement on what seats we would run at the next election, and that is part of the coalition agreement.
And do you reckon there was a deal, though, when Scott Morrison went to Glasgow to agree to net zero by 2050? There was much talk of a deal had to be struck with Barnaby Joyce. And then, of course, at the beginning of this election campaign, there's all these billions for the bush and everyone's saying, aha, draw the dots, that was the deal.
Yeah, but you could argue that all the time. I mean, we always horse trade. I was quite public, and I made a joke earlier on the way in this evening, was that, you know, I acted like an opposition leader at times against my own coalition government to get the best deal for the bush. We got extra funding through the Snowy Hydro scheme with the legacy fund that was once we sold our share to the feds.
So is that what Teal independence would do? Just as the National Party puts pressure on the Liberal Party to do the best for the bush, so the Teals would do the best for their electorates, not only with local issues, but on the issues of integrity, climate change and the treatment of women.
I think the difference again is that the National Party is a party. It actually presents policies going into an election, and our policies are on our website. We're pretty strong on it, and we've been around for a long time. What the Till independents, so-called independents, and we've got to be honest about this, they're being funded by a particular group with an agenda of some sort. Are they as independent as they claim to be? The question has to be answered. It was great to see independents coming out today talking about what they would expect in an agreement with either side of politics. But the reality here is that at the end of the day, you know exactly what you get with the National Party in coalition with the Liberal Party.
Except that you can't see the agreement.
But there is no real agreement. But it's the same with the Labor Party when they do a deal with the Greens, right? You already know what's on the table.
Quick response from Michael.
Oh, hang on, no, it's actually a published document in the ACT. The deal between Labor and the Greens to form government is a published document that people can actually hold both parties to account in government over.
Michael?
So it's...
Well, I think federally they've ruled it out, and I think there won't be a deal from either political party. But I do think I disagree with the characterisation. I think that actually the Teal independents are performing more like a political party than any independents that have come before them. And they have been more coordinated in any way before, and also more clear on their policy agenda. I think what people have a concern with whether it's in any coalition, whether it's the Nationals and the Liberal Party or any other, is this idea that the tail is wagging the dog. The smaller party is forcing their an agenda that's not widely held onto the smaller parties, and I don't think anyone's going to allow that to happen. But I do think that it's going to change.
Jenny?
But beyond, the Teal's argument about climate change and about an integrity commission, both of which are reasonably not that well defined, and then plus something about the treatment of women, again, not very well defined. I'm not quite sure how they'd vote on anything, and that's what the business of government is. Lots and lots and lots of bills, day after day after day. They'd have to make their minds up on that. Well, heavens knows how they, in which way they'd vote. Yes, they'd probably do a bit of horse trading as well. Often horse trading, by the way, comes down to, you'll do this for my electorate. Which is how does that fit with an integrity commission? I don't know. Maybe they would never do that. I just think all of these things are rather confused at the moment.
Okay.
But it is certainly also true that in terms of the government ramming through legislation, that's been impossible to do because they've had to deal with the senators and frankly a motley crew of crossbenchers, some of whom have done a good job in holding the government to account, some of whom are completely bonkers. It's a mixed bag, but it's certainly not a solution to what is very clear, which is a growing disillusion with the major parties.
Okay. I'm not making any comment on whether Craig Kelly, the erstwhile Lib who's now standing for the United Australia Party, is likely to win Hughes or not. I simply do not know. But Jenny, what are the prospects of negotiating with him for a vote when he's talking about the World Health Organization and a global pandemic accord? There is a meeting the day after the election, and something about cats and dogs being clubbed to death in bags in Shanghai.
Well, that's what I mean. It's non-existent. I mean, all the policies of the United Australia Party are very, very strange, to put it, most politely. But they will harvest a lot of votes from people who either believe in some of them, or who are just annoyed with governments, annoyed with the lockdowns, for example, annoyed with vaccine mandates. And that actually has an appeal in all sorts of areas, and it'll be their preferences the most important thing. I cannot see Craig Kelly possibly being in the being elected to Parliament, and frankly, wouldn't want him to be.
Cats and dogs of Australia can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not sure that Craig was any threat to them, but I'm pretty sure Beijing wasn't either. It can be hard to keep up with the policies that impact you and your family over the course of the campaign. This year will be a decade since the biggest social reform since Medicare was introduced to Parliament, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And for anyone on the NDIS, one of the big issues is whether they'll continue to have the support they need, with plan appeals to court reportedly rising by about 270% in the last year. So to find out whether the scheme is really working as intended and what each party is offering, the Drum spoke to advocate Dr George Talapouris, who's been interviewing politicians who could shape the NDIS as part of a series called Reasonable and Necessary.
Hi, I'm Dr George Talapouris, and welcome to our special election series of Reasonable and Necessary.
Hey, George, thanks for having me on your podcast.
Hi, George, it's great to be back.
Hi, Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Oh, my absolute pleasure.
I think that all of the politicians were very honest about their plans. If the Greens hold the balance of power after the next election, what changes will you try to negotiate on the NDIS?
Lifting of the staffing cap that is currently placed on the agency. Now, what that means is you'll be able to ring up and speak to somebody directly. You'll be able to speak to the same person multiple times.
2 words: restore trust. I don't want the NDIS to be a second full-time job for people dealing with bureaucracy. At the moment, it is a bureaucratic nightmare.
Now that we've got, over 500,000 Australians into the scheme, the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years is really, I think, about maturing the scheme.
People want to know who's going to rebuild trust. They want to know who's going to bring the community and the government to a place where we are not fighting, where we're working together collaboratively and where we want the same outcomes.
For me, the issue is let's get the initial plan right. The time spent listening, co-designing, getting that first plan right is fundamental to the success.
We would not have the NDIS if it wasn't for Bill Short.
It has too often felt like we've had to fight the very scheme that we set up.
Jordan gets it. He lives with disability. He was part of that community.
The journey we've got to continue on with is how can we keep reducing those decision times down, but also making sure that people are getting the right plan.
The need to ensure that we listen to by the government has certainly been heard by the individuals.
Everybody should be concerned about the sustainability, and sustainability doesn't mean cuts. Sustainability really means that it is affordable into the long term.
This isn't a question of cost. This is a question of moral and legal obligations.
I do want to stop the waste of money on consultants. I do want to stop the waste of money on high-priced lawyers taking matters to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal.
I'd like to say that your vote matters, your vote counts, and that is really critical that you understand what all of the politicians are thinking when it comes to the NDIS. And vote for who you think will deliver on the NDIS.
Let's start with you, Christina. You're a participant in the NDIS. We heard Green Senator there saying, I feel like we're fighting the scheme we helped set up. Jordan Steele-John. Is that how it feels?
Oh, pretty much. It's the fabulous George, who's doing excellent work, and particularly in this election series that he's been doing on his podcast. But, you know, the thing that really interests me about the NDIS is that it is just this outrageous layer of bureaucracy. And I think, you know, it's one of those, if you were building a camel in the dark, would it end up looking like something? And, you know, we've ended up with an NDIS that's just this outrageous bureaucratic behemoth. And it seems to be more focused on mega compliance and this horrible suspicion that all disabled people want is 5 cents they don't deserve. And, you know, all the evidence is telling us that that's not the case. International studies have shown that, you know, if disabled people run our own space, we tend to do it much cheaper than everybody else. Bill Shorten talked about the layers of consultants. It's not just lawyers and people like that. There's also, because of the staffing cap, which I might point out the Disability Royal Commission has experienced as well, they're not allowed to actually employ people. They have to have labour hire staff coming in, which means we don't have experienced staff doing the work. And I often go back to thinking, you know, what we originally designed was something that was supportive of people achieving our goals in life, of getting ourselves out there and doing stuff. And what we've ended up with is something that is so focused on compliance, it's forgetting about how we actually operate as humans. I'd like to draw our attention to a couple of parts of it. One of them is systems like the tax system and ASIC, the company's monitoring regulatory system. They actually operate on an assumption that you're going to do the right thing, and then they educate you when you're not quite meeting standards. So it's a very different process, and it doesn't use nearly as much bureaucracy to achieve the same levels of compliance. I might point out there's usually about a 2% non-compliance in most systems that are large. But the other thing that's come out in a couple of the policies, Jordan Steele-John really does know his stuff. He's great, of course. You know, our one openly disabled person in the federal parliament, which is a sad indictment, but also points us to another thing which Bill Shorten's talked about. We need more disabled people in there running the NDIS, being part of the decision-making part of it, not just the foot soldiers doing the bureaucratic work at the low levels, but what about the board? You know, they've just reappointed, or they've just appointed a new chair after years and years and years of us saying we need a disabled person to be the chair of the NDIS. What do we get? A non-disabled person as the new chair. So, you know, it is about government listening to disabled people. It's about them understanding that we need to trust this system. It's not just a 5-minute presence in our existence, it's every day, constantly for the rest of our lives. We are dealing with the NDIS. So it has to be sorted out. There's some really, really difficult bureaucratic hurdles that we need to really fix. Systemic reform. There's no other way to look at this other than systemic reform. It's going to need a big root and branch thing, as they say.
Jennifer, your own newspaper, the Australian Financial Review, has done a lot of detailed reporting on this, and the conclusion they drew is that everybody seems to think that we've ended up in a bit of a mess after a decade, but it's not entirely clear why. So we've got this record funding. A $30 billion a year scheme is already outstripping Medicare. It's projected to grow to $60 billion by the end of the decade. By that time, the current 500,000 recipients are anticipated to grow to 860,000 recipients. The benefits were also always supposed to outweigh the costs, but we're seeing initially that early intervention is not driving down the number of participants in the scheme. That was the thought, that their future needs would be reduced. And it's a bit of a patchy record on workforce participation as well, which, might have something to do with prejudice of employers and so on. But we're pouring all this money as a country into the scheme, and yet there's this real anxiety that people's funding's getting cut all the time and could at any moment be cut all the time. It's an extraordinary confluence of events. Jennifer?
Well, I think part of the problem has been that people do obviously need this scheme. Many people need this scheme, but people are staying on it longer than was expected, and far more people are applying for it and being accepted into the scheme than was expected. I mean, in many ways, that's not surprising. You've got a scheme that is more generous in some ways than many other alternatives. And then you can't kind of demand the ability to have that and to have the proper services and then not expect, frankly, the costs to grow out of control. I agree that it's terribly bureaucratic, and I'm sure there are lots of ridiculous extra costs baked in through consultants and lawyers and things, but really that is not, that is still around the edges. This is going to be an incredibly expensive scheme. We're not being honest about the fact that as more people want to go on it, for all sorts of reasons, it's not just catastrophic illness, it's just, for example, helping people who've got kids with mild autism, for example. Those costs are just kind of never ending. Then there's the whole idea about, mental issues and how to deal with that, whether they should be included. So those costs are going to go up and up and up, no matter what. And every person who needs it or assistance will say, well, I deserve this, and how could you possibly cut me off or reduce my cost? But we're not being honest as a society, and then saying, well, okay, this is going to cost an extraordinary amount of money, but we're not going to, how do we pay for it? Well, nobody wants to put up taxes. So I'm not quite sure how we actually come at this, other than saying it's going to cost a lot more, and as a society we've got to be more honest about how we're going to pay for it if we're willing to do so.
Christine, I mean, there has been by 2025 there'll be a doubling of the participation of young people in the scheme, a doubling on what the Productivity Commission envisaged back in 2011 when they were thinking and dreaming about a scheme like this. So how do you deal with that?
Just a couple of clarifiers there. It's about disability. You don't wake up one day and your disability's suddenly gone. It's there. It's with you for life. If people have long-term conditions, that's a different thing. It's not disability. And there is, people are finding it incredibly hard to get onto the NDIS. They spend years over it. And it's about proving that. We also know under the old scheme, and the Productivity Commission told us this, if we kept going the way we were going before, it was going to cost us twice as much. For only less than half of all disabled people had less than half of what they needed. So people couldn't go out to work, people couldn't go to the shops for themselves, they couldn't live independently, which of course studies show reduces the amount of support that's required. So there's a lot of things about the scheme that are actually going to be reducing the costs that people have. But what we had in the old scheme was a bunch of people who never got any support at all, and people who only got half as much support as they required. So we're fixing that stuff. And it is about contributing to society. You know, here I am being a CEO. Now, I wouldn't be able to do that without the NDIS. I wouldn't be able to hold down my job. I wouldn't be able to get to meetings like the one I had this morning. I wouldn't be able to travel and do the work that I do without the NDIS. And I'm paying taxes, thanks very much, including the extra layer of tax that was put on to assist with funding the NDIS. So I think we need to remember that disability is for life. It is not something that you recover from one day and get over and move on from. What we can do is actually arrive at a point of maintenance. So we're not in crisis mode all the time. We're not constantly needing 24/7 high levels of support, but we can actually operate as people who need support here and there. So, you know, people need to get a bit of a handle on the fact that disability is, you know, once you get into the scheme, you're there, you stay in it. And that was always the intention. And for people with psychosocial disability, or what is sometimes referred to as mental illness, the people with psychosocial disability are in the same boat. You don't wake up one day and your schizophrenia has disappeared. It stays with you. What you hope for is that it might actually be fairly maintained so that it isn't going up and down like a yo-yo all the time, causing you to have periods of really serious unwellness where you have to dip out of the workforce and out of life generally, that sort of stuff. So let's just remember these things. What we're not getting at the moment is a system that supports that equilibrium for people. The fact that it's putting us through some of these processes, and you know, everybody I know is getting pre-planning anxiety because we're all concerned that our funds will be cut, and then we'll spend the next 12 months having to fight to get something so that we can leave the house independently. I mean, really?
John Barilaro, it's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, Linda Reynolds last year was talking this new narrative from the government about hard discussions about rising costs and the need to put it on a sustainable footing, and it has generated an awful lot of trauma and stress. And we saw in the first debate, didn't we, a woman standing up saying, my child's package has been cut by 30%, what am I going to do? How difficult is it going to be to have that conversation about reforming a system that people like Christina and thousands of Australians, millions of Australians fought for, when there's this degree of suspicion and lack of trust?
Yeah, look, firstly, I mean, as a state, I remember in New South Wales, Andrew Constance was a disabilities minister, and we signed up to the NDIS, and credit to Julia Gillard, it's something that we don't actually give her enough acknowledgement for. We signed up because of the person-centred approach, allowing people to make their own decisions in relation to the services required. And the concern was always, were we actually honest enough with what the total cost will be? And I think that's the theme today. And there is going to have to be a honest conversation with the Australian public. Remembering the Australian public embraced the opportunity to see the Medicare levy be increased to cover the cost initially. So the reality now is that we have a scheme that needs to be in place sustainably and in an affordable way. But that's a tough conversation. And I think, you know, when we first modelled it and when governments modelled it originally, we weren't honest enough, or we may not have known the true cost of it. But now we're starting to see the true cost of it. I like the narrative that this isn't about dealing with crisis, but just getting people back onto a steady footing. And that's where we've got to go. This is a scheme that as Australians we support and will continue to support, and we need in place.
A quick comment, Michael?
Well, I think it's interesting that the government's got themselves in a bit of a pickle here, where on the one hand they say there's no cuts happening into the NDIS, and on the other hand they say, but if there were, it's justified because there's some costs involved here. Now, just to put this in perspective, the NDIS is an expensive scheme, but it's $20 billion. The pension is $190 billion. Do we want to have a discussion about whether or not the pension's affordable and sustainable? I mean, what we've got to do is put this in a little bit of perspective. The interest we pay on Commonwealth debt is $20 billion, the same amount we put onto the NDIS. So yes, it sounds like a scary number when we mention it, and yes, we obviously need to manage costs, but I think we just got to put all these questions into a bit of perspective.
Good discussion. You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, former leader of the New South Wales Nationals and former New South Wales Deputy Premier John Barilaro, CEO of the McKell Institute and former New South Wales Labor Chief of Staff and Policy Director Michael Buckland. In Melbourne tonight, National Affairs columnist at the Australian Financial Review, Jennifer Hewitt, and in Canberra, CEO of the Disability Leadership Institute, Christina Ryan. With less than a week to go before polling day, the Coalition has announced the final pillar of its housing policy. It's squarely aimed at accelerating the time it takes to work up a deposit for a first home, the single biggest hurdle to property ownership for millions of Australians. Under the scheme, the government will allow first home buyers to raid up to 40% of their superannuation balance, up to $50,000, to add to their existing deposit. It means that both major parties are now offering policies that analysts say will further add to demand for housing. The Drum's David Taylor has more.
That 1,500,000 here back with our opening bidder now first.
Saving up hundreds of thousands of dollars towards a home deposit has become one of the biggest obstacles to home ownership.
So, congratulations to World Board.
A proportion of younger Australians withdraw cash from the bank of mum and dad to help them build a deposit for their first home. For those who wouldn't otherwise have access to large piles of cash, the Coalition says it'll once again unlock the vault holding your superannuation, this time to allow first home buyers access to tens of thousands of extra dollars.
We stand on the edge of a new era of opportunity. Better days are now ahead.
Labor's already released their housing policy with its Help to Buy scheme, where to buy a property you'll need to be living at home or renting, stump up a 2% deposit and earn $90,000 a year or less for singles and $120,000 for couples.
Which is based upon a scheme here in WA that has operated effectively for 3 decades.
The Coalition had a policy heading into the election campaign it said would put more Australians into home ownership. Under the Home Guarantee Scheme, first home buyers will only need to stump up a 5% deposit and 2% for single parents. Individuals can earn up to $120,000, while the income cap is $200,000 for couples.
Thank you all very, very much.
The latest announcement hones in on the need to build a large deposit quickly. Under the Super Home Buyer Scheme, first home buyers will be able to invest up to 40% of their superannuation, up to a maximum of $50,000, to help with the purchase of their first home. You will need to prove you've already saved up a 5% deposit. The scheme will apply to both new and existing homes, with the invested amount, including a share of any capital gain, to be returned to their superannuation fund when the house is sold. That part of the policy raises a critical question. How do you upgrade? The Coalition says its scheme helps first home buyers get onto the first rung of the property ladder. But what about the second and the third? Because when you sell your home, the capital gains go back into superannuation. So if your family wants to upgrade or you just want a bigger house, the question is, how is that achieved? Here's what the Prime Minister had to say about that.
Over time, as you own your first home, it is our intention to ensure that you might be able to pay that down. And that means when you get to the next stage, you may well refinance. This is a well thought through plan, which means that it won't put that added pressure on.
But it will, according to at least one Coalition senator, put upwards pressure on property prices.
I would imagine that there would be a lot of people that bring forward their decision to buy a house. So I would imagine in the short term you might see a bump in house prices, but that doesn't play out the long-term benefits of more home ownership.
Independent economist Saul Eslake disagrees. He's been a vocal critic of the policy since it was announced.
Anything that allows Australians to spend more on housing than they otherwise would results primarily in more expensive housing rather than in more people owning that housing, that is, in higher home ownership rates.
Jennifer Hewitt, let's start with you on this one. Super for housing, what do you think?
I think it'll be a very popular move. It won't be quite as dramatic as the government's trying to pretend, nor will it be the same attack on super that or forcing up prices in the way that Labor is insisting it will. We've got to remember right at this moment, we're probably more likely with rising interest rates to see a fall in house prices over the next couple of years. Who knows though, we've all been wrong. All the experts have been wrong on what's happening to housing prices, but in general, they tend to go up. But I think the idea that you can use your superannuation and then have to return it to superannuation to get yourself access to a deposit is a reasonable one. It's not as though it's going to disappear from super altogether. And for those people particularly who cannot rely on the bank of mum and dad to assist them, and it's actually it's been very, very hard. I think this is one way of helping people, and that it will be reasonably popular, even though very few would have enough in their superannuation accounts to be able to take out the full $50,000 maximum.
Yeah, we went through some figures today. So the average for 30-year-old men is about $27,182. So the most they could take is about 11 grand, let's call it. 40-year-old men, if you look at the average amount, 40% of that would be about $26,000, right? And women, of course, have got lower super balances. So
but it would mainly be couples who would be doing this. Not always, but you have a lot of couples that be doing that, so they would be doubled.
And would it have any real effect? I mean, another statistic from the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees was nearly 1 million young workers under the age of 35 either closed their accounts or have less than $1,000 in super because they used the COVID early release scheme. Jennifer, so I'm just wondering, what's your view of it? Does it mean that people who wouldn't be able to get a deposit together, or merely people who've done a bit of saving, who are a little bit on the way, just get there a bit quicker?
I think it would mainly mean that people who are already on the way and are doing some saving will be able to get there quicker. And that will be exactly the type of people that Morrison's trying to appeal to. To the extent that it would drive up housing prices a bit, I'm not sure that it will really that much. I mean, we've had what we've been calling a kind of semi-permanent housing crisis in Australia about affordability for decades. And there's always these, attempts to address it by various government funding schemes, both state and federal. In the end, it's a lot more complicated than that. There is no silver bullet. But in the same way that Labor's attempting to have a scheme which would help lower and middle income buyers as well, get a deposit and pay off home loans. These are all kind of band-aids to what is a fairly fundamental problem for the Australian houses, but neither do people who have had their houses for a while want to see them go down dramatically.
Christina, there's sort of a clear comparison emerging with Labor. The coalition's saying use your own money from your own super to boost your deposit, or join a scheme where the Labor government takes equity in your house to boost your buying power. There's your choice.
Yeah, I was wondering, are these the same people who used all this super to survive the early part of the pandemic before JobKeeper arrived? So how much super is there really out there? I'm concerned about the precedent as well. If it's okay to raise your super for this, what else will there be down the track? Suddenly it's back onto the individual all the time to be coming up with the funds, when what we're not seeing from anybody really is where's the structural reform across the economy to address inequality, the growing inequality, not just around housing, but we've seen education, medical costs, childcare, all of these things that are big system-wide reforms that are needed. So, where are we heading with this stuff, that we keep tinkering with these systems around the edges, keep tweaking them, rather than doing some big structural reform? And it's all right to say, it's only a short-term thing, but we've seen short-term thing before, like negative gearing, which was supposed to come in for a short period, but we now can't get rid of. And of course, that's created this appalling inflationary thing around investment is actually the sort of preference in the property market rather than ownership for live-in owners. I think we need to be really, really careful about this. So, when people like Saul Eslake sort of stick their hand up and just say, no, don't do this, I think we need to be listening very closely to that. It's concerning to me that a short-term policy might actually be something that people latch onto, only to discover in 10, 15, 20 years' time that it's cost them their financial security in older age. And of course, we already have older women as the largest growing group in the homelessness space. So, what is this doing to address that? What's it doing to actually grow the rental property market? I don't see anything about those sorts of things. We need some serious looking at social housing in this country. We've fallen behind there over the last decade. And things have just fallen off the radar, which have ended up with us having growing inequality We need policies about that.
Okay.
And I'm not hearing it.
I mean, this is, Michael, existential question is always, what is super for? More existential crisis than friggin' Hamlet, to be or not to be. It's supposed to be for retirement benefit, not for retirement income, for retirement benefit. That's the sole purpose of it. Well, I mean, it's kind of unarguable, isn't it, that the 15% of Australians who are age pensioners who rent their homes today are living in poverty. That's just how that sum works out. And in 35 years' time, a third of retirees, that's, the 30-year-olds of today, won't own their own home. They'll be living in poverty. So doesn't owning your own home or having a chance at owning your own home, doesn't that benefit your retirement?
I think many people would like to own their own home, but if this policy would do anything to support that, then maybe it would be worthwhile, but it won't. So what we spent the better part at the McKell Institute of the last year working with eminent Professor Leishman out of the University of South Australia's Centre for Housing and Urban and Regional Planning, looking at exactly this policy. If you took out $40,000, what effect would that have on house prices out of your super? And what we found in, let's take Brisbane, for example. The $40,000 you take out of your super and give into housing will lead to a $99,000 increase in house prices. So at the end of this process, you end up with $40,000 less in your super account and $49,000 more on your mortgage because house prices went up in the meantime. And it's because what's happening is people aren't going to use this super just to pay down their mortgage. They're going to use it to help them borrow more. And this fuels house prices. It's exactly what Saul Eslake said, but it's what every respectable economist is saying. It's going to fuel house price rises and it's going to end up making people worse off from both ends.
OK, so then to the politics of it, why on earth in a 50-something minute speech was this the one big shiny thing that the Prime Minister wanted to bring forward? The word wedge has been used in relation to your party.
I think there's a little bit of ideology in here, but I also think that we're talking about a policy that, I take Jennifer's point, it sounds good. People do, from the first time they see it, they like it. Much like first home buyer grants, which have also been proven to push up house prices and not have any effect on home ownership. But they were, almost every government, whether Labor or Liberal, that has introduced first home buyer grants has then been trying to get rid of them, and some have. So the point here is that as much as it might be politically popular, it ultimately is not the way. It's not going to achieve what it's intended to achieve. And if it's intended to achieve getting people into the housing market, it won't. And that's another finding I would just add. One of the things, the Senator is right, Senator Hume is right when she says that what it will do is bring forward purchases for people who would already be planning on buying a property. So what happens is it doesn't bring new people into the property market. It just brings the existing property owners forward, and in doing so, it punishes them. And to take your point, which you made the point of the size of the super balances for certain people, unless you get more than $40,000, it has no impact on whether people are going to bring forward their house prices.
So unless you can withdraw at least $40,000,
that's right,
you're not going to be that much better off.
So you have this situation where either the policy will give you no benefit at all because you're not going to, the $9,000 isn't actually going to help you get into the housing market, or it gives you so much of a benefit that it pushes up house prices and you end up worse off overall.
John, does the politics of this work in the sense that this is the one policy on housing that Albanese wasn't going to be able to say, me too, I'll do the same thing?
This is wedge politics, but it's actually good politics and it's good policy. I'm a fan of it. And we always talk about superannuation being able to make sure that in retirement that we're all financially independent. Well, home ownership is another tool. So it was never intended that superannuation alone was going to give us all a fantastic retirement. If you are going to spend the next 20, 30 years making a landlord rich because you're paying rent, and the issue here is rents are going up because the price of property is going up, that the obstacle has been the deposit. So the ability to actually access super for that deposit actually makes sense. So politically, this is a smart policy.
But the assumption that you've got wrapped up in there, and that's where Jenny started us, was you have to believe that housing prices only ever go up, that no government will ever do anything to stop the investors supercharging property prices in this country, and therefore you should get into the property market any way you can, including raiding your super. That's the only way this sort of policy makes sense, isn't it?
You look at history. I mean, history shows clearly that bricks and mortar, investment in bricks and mortar, eventually always goes up. There's no doubt that it's an investment into the future.
But that's not some miracle of economics. That's because of government policy.
But the reality here is, you know, if you want to separate the two about housing affordability and what access to a deposit, they're two separate issues. The real issue, and I should be transparent because I now work for a development company. What
are they developing?
We're developing a build-to-rent product. We're of course building in Western Sydney, and we're doing apartments.
So you're banking on this not working?
No, the reality is demand's outstripping supply. The real issue in relation to housing affordability, one is government taxes, both local and state government taxes. Two is supply. And that's the reality here. And if you go back to the Productivity Commissioner or the Grattan Institute reports, it's clearly about supply, and we've got to sort the supply side of it.
So how does this policy help?
This allows people to get into the property market who are paying rent. And in many cases, people pay more in their rent than they would in a repayment in a low interest environment. And with interest rates, this is about timing. I tell you what, if you're going to have such a policy, do it while interest rates are on the rise, because we are going to see a contraction in home ownership or people looking to buy. This is probably the right time for it. So the policy actually makes sense today. The politics absolutely works, and it's actually one that I think is very popular with the public.
Jennifer?
Yes, I agree with John, actually. And although the fact that I'm saying that prices are likely to kind of go down because of rising interest rates, I mean, it is true that the whole long-term trend is relentless rise in prices. And to the extent that people argue that this will only inflate the housing price, well, yes, of course it will, but to that extent, so will Labor's policy. But the idea of increasing supply, I mean, we've been having this debate for, just decades about the increasing supply, and people, they're also very keen on restrictions and residential restrictions and zoning laws and things like that, as well as all those kind of state government taxes and things. So in the end, I think this is actually probably a good time when prices are going to, if anything, go down, to allow more people to bring forward their ability to get into the market. And so I agree with John. I think it's both good policy and good politics. And I do not think it will damage people's long-term retirement savings at all, partly because, as people have pointed out, it's very, very useful to have your own home in terms of avoiding poverty. But plus, that you will also be putting your own superannuation or your own money back into superannuation once you do sell.
More broadly, Christina, I'm interested in this one, and I'm reminded of the massive contribution to this country made by not only your good self, but your grandmother Edna Ryan, who not only did the work of collecting the data so that women could be granted the same minimum wage as men, but also was bristled when she was told that she was unable to join a superannuation fund because she's a woman. And I wonder whether, Christina, times have changed and secure housing is an important part of the discussion about a secure and reasonable retirement.
Well, it's a fundamental human right for a reason. Without secure housing, you can't do all of the other stuff. You can't go to school, you can't go to work, all those things that you need. And I remain really concerned that such policies are not addressing the fundamental inequality. So people who do not have access to the housing market, how will this give them access? To me, it sounds very much like people who already have some economic privilege are going to be able to further their own aims. Great, that's nice, but it's not actually going to bring in people who are on low incomes or people like disabled people who really don't have much of an ambition of home ownership because their financial insecurity is so high. So we're not addressing inequality in this country. We need structural reform. And, women do have a lot less super. We know that. That's just a fact. It's not addressing that. It's not actually having a look at whether people dipping into a system like this are going to be changing their financial security in retirement. And we've heard a few opinions about how that might look and pan out. So, I'm just wary of that. And when does such a policy turn on and turn off? Do we just keep doing it? And what about other things that start happening? You can use your super for this, you can use your super for that. Use it to save yourself in a pandemic so that you've got income. Where does it stretch to? And particularly if you've only got low balances, the more you use at the front end, the less the interest is going to help you with getting something at the back end.
Just finally on this point, what about the idea that you can downsize and put more money into super? Now, that's a scheme that exists at the moment, Jennifer Hewitt, where if you're 65 and over, you can sell your home if you've lived in it for 10 years, and you can take $300,000 of that and you can put it into superannuation above the limits that exist. That's, the Coalition says we'll take that down to 55. Why would anybody do that if they had to buy another house to live in and just make a massive contribution to the state government in stamp duty? Like, how does that make sense?
Well, I think that's true. I think the stamp duty is a very big issue, but no state government wants to address that, it seems. The New South Wales Liberal government has made a few moves in that direction, but is not getting any support for it. But in terms of why you'd want to do that, you'd also definitely get, particularly if you've got a big house and or a larger house, or an empty nester, and suddenly there's either just you or there's you and a spouse. Well, then it makes more sense to put the money in superannuation to live in a smaller apartment, say. We don't have enough of those, of course, but again, I think it's reasonable policy. The only question that I would have with that is it reasonable policy? We've already got quite a lot of tax breaks on superannuation. To encourage more tax breaks into superannuation may be a bit more dubious, but I don't think there's any doubt that it would encourage more people to sell their big houses and free up bigger houses for younger families with kids.
And on the way, make a massive contribution in stamp duty to their local, state or territory government. We all love stamp duty, don't we? A record number of Australians have already made up their mind as to who they want to run the country for the next 3 years. They are not listening, la, 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 la. They're foregoing their democracy sausage and they've been voting early. Look at this. According to the AEC, as of yesterday, the total number of pre-poll votes was just shy of 2 million, represented there by the orange line on the graph. Now, have a look at the blue line. That's pre-polling in 2016. You can see that early voting this year has already overtaken the number that had been cast at this point back then, and it's on track to overtake the number cast in 2019 as well. And if you add in all the postal votes, almost 2.5 million applications have been made so far, and as of yesterday, the AEC has received approximately 1 million responses. What's happening, John Barilaro? Are they all sick of it?
Oh, no, this is how it should be. We live in a great democracy. We want everyone to participate. We have a great voter turnout, and it's because we're flexible. And having pre-poll, I think, is a good outcome. At a state level, we've even done the online digital version.
Yes, I voted digitally in New South Wales. It was marvellous.
Absolutely. So this is the way it should be. We love our Saturdays. We've got kids' sport in general. So not having to turn up for the democracy sausage is not a bad thing. But the reality is we get to a point in the campaign where everyone switches off. We want to vote. And you know what? I love pre-poll. And actually, as a local member, the opportunity to meet more people at pre-poll was actually not a bad little experience for everybody. So this is great, and you don't have to wait till Saturday.
Jennifer, do you think it indicates that people have just wanted to cast their vote in order to stop listening, or something else?
Oh, no, I think it's just a matter of convenience, really. I went and did a pre-poll myself, and a woman said to me, "Oh, have you got a reason for voting early?" And I went to open my mouth, and she just said, "Just say yes." So, okay, fine. But I'm slightly, so I use it myself. I understand the benefits of it. I guess I'm just a little kind of apprehensive about what this does to the idea of a snapshot in time and a whole electorate voting together on one day. And when you've got more than half the electorate voting, over a period of a few weeks, that's very different. And I also, as you've seen from the government's housing policy released only 6 days before polls close, and missing millions of voters in that sense, I'm not sure that the political parties in general have actually coped with this new idea, this new timetable for campaigning.
What about you, Michael? How hard is it for the major political parties to kind of present their offering, or any political party, any candidate, to present their offering when people are voting, all through the back end of the campaign?
Well, I think what you might see is people making more policy announcements earlier, and that certainly did happen this campaign, and it's been this way for a while. But ultimately, I think what we've seen is that campaigning is not happening just for over 4 weeks now, it's happening over 3 years. So people are getting People are getting tired of politics and they're just voting at the first opportunity. But they've had 3 years to get to know people, and this constant campaigning is
But that's not what the
here to
polls
stay.
say. The polls say there's a whole bunch of people who are humming and hawing about what to do.
I think there'll always be a lot of people, but the people who voted have certainly made up their mind, and that is at a record high, the people who've voted already.
What do you think it suggests, Christina?
Oh, look, I think people are a bit over it, and I think this long campaign is, tedious, to be frank. I genuinely think it's about politicians and the media, and you know, the average person is getting on with our lives. We've had a lot to deal with in the last couple of years, so we just don't want more. But I actually think this is something that more independence in the parliament might contribute to, is having more of an ongoing process over the 3 years. Actually, 4-year fixed terms would be a good thing, I reckon. I think Michael's wrong. I think, you know, suggesting that there's a higher level of engagement, it's easy for us inside the tent, you know, that 15 or 20% of actually politically engaged folk to think that there's something that everybody's thinking. But the reality is most people just want it to go away. You know, just give us a decent life, get on with it, and stop coming up with sort of stunts on television that we have to then respond to, or divisive comment, you know, or upsetting whole communities by saying things, you know, and we've had a bit of that in this campaign as well. So, yeah, I think we all just want to vote and get it over with. Although I will actually be going out on election day itself, because women fought and died for the right to vote. So I like to do it on election day if I can.
I do. I like the community there. I like the snags. I like the chaos of trying to work out how to get everybody to sport and vote at the same time, the tension of it. I adore voting on election day. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Fantastic.
That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, to John Barilaro, Michael Buckland. Thanks for coming in. Jennifer Hewitt and Christina Ryan in Canberra. Jules is in tomorrow night. Have a great evening. Good night.
Saturday, Australia decides.
Together we can build a better future.
Strong economy means a stronger future.
Who will be our next PM?
Because we're backing you.
Australians deserve better.
Join Australia's best political minds as we bring you live results seat by seat.
Lost 1 or 2 seats to independents.
Can the coalition go a 4th term, or will Labor rise to power? Australia votes. Saturday from 6 on ABC, or live stream on ABC iView.
The home straight, how political leaders fight it out over housing affordability.
Thank you for what you're doing. They think it's their money to tell you what to do with. I believe it's your money.
This is an attack on future savings. It's an attack on future generations.
St John warns public alerts about ambulance delays in WA are likely to become more common. Cricket fans pay tribute to Andrew Symonds.
And coming up on the business, supercharged housing fears the coalition's proposed property plan will push up prices while depleting retirement savings.
Good evening, Michael Tetlow with ABC Late News. Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have finally locked themselves in a head-to-head contest for votes, with rival policies for first home buyers front and centre. What the coalition calls its game-changer idea to let people dip into their superannuation has become a red line issue for Labor, which warns it's a threat to the nation's retirement savings system. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Scott Morrison's re-election gamble on bricks and mortar.
Getting the deposit is the hardest part.
The Prime Minister promoting his plan to allow first home buyers early access to their superannuation.
So they don't have to stand on the curb and watch house prices run away from them.
Scott Morrison will bulldoze your super and push up house prices.
Oh my God! In an election campaign of relatively few policy contests,
See that second slip?
the battle over housing is as hot as the property market's been. The coalition scheme would see first home buyers dip into their superannuation, capped at 40% or $50,000. Labor's policy would see the government take an equity stake in the home of low and modest income earners, also capped at 40%. But when the property is sold, the contribution plus a share of any capital gain would either go back into super or back to the government.
It's your money and it should be your home. But the master planning on this development.
Both schemes would require a deposit, 5% under the Coalition, 2% under Labor.
I know the benefit of a secure roof over your head. It's my life.
But both policies run the risk of inflating house prices, a minister admitting as much about the Coalition's proposal.
I would imagine in the short term you might see a bump in house prices.
Minister Hume belled the cat this morning.
When you look at the proportion of first home buyers of the entire real estate market, it's quite marginal.
The rival housing policies highlighting the ideological split over superannuation.
This is an attack on future savings. It's an attack on future generations.
What could possibly be wrong with letting Australians use their own savings to buy the most important asset they will ever own in their lives?
Labor's been so keen to keep the focus on Scott Morrison, it's matched many coalition policies over the past few weeks. By drawing the line on super for housing, Anthony Albanese gives his opponent the fight he so clearly wants. The PM says it's about individual choice and aspiration. For Labor, it's about defending a totemic economic policy, a philosophical scrap that'll be decided in 5 days. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
COVID-19 continues to wreak havoc on WA's health system, with St John Ambulance predicting recent public alerts about response time delays are likely to be repeated. For the first time, the number of people hospitalised with COVID has passed 300, prompting doctors and nurses groups to call for the return of the mask mandate.
The day's first photo op for the Labor campaign featured Perth nurse Dylan Botica on his coffee break. According to the Nurses Union, it would have been a much-needed break.
It won't be long before we have unnecessary deaths in our health system simply because the government won't take these basic steps.
The ANF and AMA want the mask mandate returned. With 88,000 active cases and more than 2,200 hospital staff isolating, they warn the system is approaching breaking point.
We may well be reintroducing restrictions. We would prefer not to. We would rather get over this peak and get down to the other side.
I'll let Amber comment, but I just think people should stop scaremongering.
The health unions say the facts are on their side.
The bottom line is Fiona Stanley right now, even as we speak, is in code yellow. It is in bed state black for ICU, which means there's no ICU beds, and the ED is full. Now, that's not scaremongering, that's just fact.
The doctors and nurses warn the real canary in the coal mine may be St John Ambulance.
Lovely to see you all again. It's becoming a regular occurrence.
The ambulance service says people should expect to see more of its recent unprecedented public warnings about delayed response times to 000 calls.
I've got 108 paramedics across the organisation who are on COVID leave, and the majority of those are COVID positive.
The government's previously criticised St John for a failure to implement critical worker protocols. But the organisation now has paramedics who are asymptomatic close contacts back at work, and the impact's been minimal, putting only one van back on the road each shift, maybe two if they're lucky.
It's good to have that, but it's not going to make the problem disappear overnight.
These pressures have come with 12,000 daily cases. The coming weeks could bring a new peak of 25,000. James Carmody, ABC News.
It's been a shocking year for fans of cricket. First, the deaths of Rod Marsh and Shane Warne, now Andrew Symonds. On the field, he was a giant, freakishly gifted and capable of single-handedly swinging a match. But to the people who knew him off it, he was humble and always willing to lend a hand.
An innings cut short for a hometown hero, a roadside memorial to mark the magic of Andrew Symonds.
It feels like it's just happened in my backyard.
He's true blue, isn't he? So, yeah, we'll miss him.
Across the globe, sporting royalty lined up to praise the prodigious talent of the man affectionately known as Roy.
We're just lucky to have had him, play our game, because he changed the game a little bit, particularly one-day cricket with his power hitting.
And when you're playing sport, there's good days, there's bad days, but having Roy around almost made it good.
On the Gold Coast, tributes were laid at Bill Pippin Oval, where former Dolphins teammates say he was loved both on and off the field.
He's like the Crocodile Dundee version of cricket. You know, he loved his fishing and his hunting, but I guess on the flip side of that, he could just hit a cricket ball and play the game of cricket very well.
In his North Queensland hometown, a spontaneous tribute, Rod's out for Roy, a nod to the local legend who spent much of his retirement claiming catches of a different kind. Yet he still made a point of helping up-and-coming athletes.
If he could fit something in or do something for you, he would do it.
But keen to dismiss any praise for his random yet consistent acts of kindness.
I remember I was in a bad place and he dropped off a couple of mud crabs and some beers.
It was here in Charters Towers where it all began for the elite sportsman who earned a string of accolades on the running track, in the swimming pool and, of course, on the cricket pitch. And while his talent sent him far and wide, he never forgot his North Queensland roots.
Drew was always generous with his time. If he was asked, he was a guest speaker or guest of honour at a formal dinner occasion, giving of his time for one-on-one interviews with students.
Leaving a legacy that transcended sporting codes, but one that's left the cricketing world hurting again, just months after the deaths of Rod Marsh and Shane Warne.
Maybe the great man in the sky is putting together a cricket team.
Jade Toomey, ABC News, Townsville.
The chief of NATO says Ukraine could win the war with the Russian invasion not going to plan. Ukraine says its troops defending the city of Kharkiv have advanced all the way to the Russian border. After months of shelling and occupation, residents in the region are starting to think about recovery. Europe correspondent Steve Kinane reports from the village of Molarogan.
Molarogan was a peaceful hamlet just 30 kilometres from Russian territory. Full of Russian speakers, it was a village with close links to its northern neighbours. Ties irretrievably destroyed by Putin's brutal invasion. The Russians seized Yulia's house and turned it into an observation post before trashing it on their way out.
They brought grief and destruction. We were living a happy life here. They destroyed everything in a second.
But the Ukrainians fought back, taking trenches, destroying tanks, and wiping out this warehouse that had been commandeered and used to store ammunition. Just like in the battle for Kiev, the Ukrainians drove the Russians out of the villages they'd occupied.
Why did Russians come here? Because they thought that they would be welcomed with salt and bread.
Welcome, Russia.
Now the Ukrainian military are helping these communities return to the liberated areas and making sure these villages are now safe.
When you walk down this street, you can see the absolute destruction inflicted on this village by Russian forces. And there's also what you don't see. The local military are telling us that this area, this village, was left booby-trapped and it was left mined. So when civilians came back to their homes, there were bombs inside their electronic equipment, inside their furniture.
The Ukrainians are deeply thankful for the military aid the West has been sending, including the Bushmaster vehicles sent by Australia.
Thank you very much for all Australian people for Bushmasters. It's very nice machine, and my military brothers very cool in Bushmaster and push racism home.
Soon these villages will need a different type of aid when they begin to rebuild these war-ravaged communities. Steve Kinane, ABC News, Molarogan.
West Coast's miserable season continues, with forward Liam Ryan offered a one-week suspension for rough conduct following the club's thrashing by the Demons. Defender Jeremy McGovern copped a fine for misconduct, while Melbourne's Cade Chandler is facing the prospect of 2 weeks on the sidelines.
That big bump on Melbourne's Jake Bowie in the third quarter is set to cost Liam Ryan a week on the sidelines. The incident deemed careless, high contact and of medium impact. Jeremy McGovern escaped with a $1,000 fine after he elbowed Jack Viney. Cade Chandler not so fortunate.
Foley took too long.
He's set to miss 2 weeks for this tackle that saw Luke Foley leave the ground under the concussion rule.
And Foley is hurt. His head hitting the turf.
Despite the Demons inflicting yet another heavy loss on the Eagles, West Coast is insisting there were signs of improvement in the 74-point defeat.
We had a really strong focus of going in with the contest and work rate, and I think we really sort of matched them around in that area, especially in that second quarter. So, yeah, I think, there's a lot of positive, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
The Eagles are hoping to be boosted by the possible return of a host of big names for this weekend's clash with the Giants in Sydney, with Luke Shuey and Andrew Gaff among those nearing return. Meanwhile, the Dockers are hoping to move on quickly from their shock loss to the Suns on the Gold Coast.
It's their greatest ever win against Fremantle. It's Fremantle's lowest ever score against the Gold Coast.
Fremantle struggled in challenging conditions, wasting numerous opportunities as its 6-game winning streak came to an end.
It's a long season and we learn from every game, whether it's a win or loss, and you probably learn more from the losses, so we'll review it tomorrow, take the learnings out of it and go into next week.
Both West Coast and Fremantle will wear Indigenous Guernseys for this week's Sir Doug Nicholls round. Samia O'Keefe, ABC News.
Matilda's captain Sam Kerr has scored 2 goals to help Chelsea beat Manchester City 3-2 in the FA Cup final at Wembley. Kerr opened the scoring in the 33rd minute in front of a crowd of 49,000. Her Matilda's teammates, Hayley Rasso, found an equaliser in the 89th minute to send the game into extra time before Kerr scored the match winner.
Sam Kerr goes for goal! Finds the goal! Big deflection!
I don't really care how they go in, honestly. I thought the first one I had to make sure it went over the line, and the second one we got lucky, but that's what football's about.
Kerr also scored twice in Chelsea's FA Cup victory last year. It's the second year in a row the Blues have won both the FA Cup and the Super League title. And Australian Minjee Lee has won the Founders' Cup in New Jersey to claim her first victory of the year on the US Tour. The world number 5 had a 2-under par 70 to finish 2 shots ahead of American Lexi Thompson. It was the 25-year-old's first triumph since winning her maiden major title in July last year. A shower or 2 in Perth tomorrow with a top of 24 degrees. Showers as well for Adelaide, Hobart and Brisbane. A sunny 21 degrees for Sydney and partly cloudy with 16 in Melbourne. And that's ABC Late News to the moment. I'm Michael Tetlow. Stay with us now for the business.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, supercharged housing. Fears the Coalition's proposed property plan will push up prices while depleting retirement savings.
My super is for when I'm old and for when I need to look after myself. It's not for me to go and buy a house.
And tackling tax breaks. Both major parties urged to revisit political dynamite to address housing affordability.
If the government was to seriously consider long-term changes to affordability across Australia, then they would need to look at changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax.
Well, some economists have slammed the Coalition's plan to allow first home buyers to dip into their superannuation to help fund their deposit. They say the scheme will push prices up even more and will predominantly help wealthier Australians. Scott Morrison says any impact on valuations would be cancelled out by his party's other policy, which encourages older people to downsize. Amelia Terzon reports.
Shana Caspers wants to raise Isla in their own home.
I would like somewhere for my daughter to grow up and have childhood memories in for, 20 years.
But Shana is not so desperate to buy that she'd tap into her nest egg.
My super is for when I'm old and for when I need to look after myself. It's for when I'm senile. It's not for me to go and buy a house.
While Shana isn't prepared to use retirement savings, others might.
Affordable housing is such an issue, but so is retirement savings.
It would be good in some circumstances as long as it doesn't bid up the price of housing.
It's a great opportunity for people to get into the market right now where they can make equity.
Under the plan, first home buyers who've saved a 5% deposit can access up to 40% of their super, capped at $50,000. When they sell the home, they'll return the money to their retirement savings plus a share of their capital gain.
This plan is about utilising people's own savings, their own superannuation, so they don't have to stand on the curb and watch house prices run away from them.
It will bulldoze your super and it will push up house prices.
If it does, then that's a direct transfer of wealth from younger Australians, from their superannuation, to homeowners who tend to be older and richer.
The super industry is warning that Australians will lose out if they take out retirement savings early.
So if somebody takes this money out for a housing deposit in their late 20s, they're not going to have the compounding effect. And what we mean by that is every year you get interest and returns on your superannuation, 6.5–7%.
Analysts say on average most young Australians will only be able to access about $10,000 from their super, which would only increase a standard deposit by just 1%.
The scheme is probably more advantageous for wealthy Australians who have more money in their super.
Both parties are backing another existing scheme where the government guarantees loans with low deposits. And Labor and the Greens are offering a shared equity scheme for people on low and modest incomes. That is where the government co-owns the property with you. Economists say that none of these schemes will reduce prices.
If you pour more fuel on a fire, it gets hotter. This is more money going into a finite set of houses for sale.
Some economists say that cutting back on tax breaks for property investors could ease the property boom. But this election, neither of the major parties is saying it'll make changes to negative gearing or capital gains tax concessions. When it comes to supply, the Coalition and Labor both want to fund around 30,000 new homes for social housing, while the Greens have a more ambitious idea.
I don't know if the Greens' policy of 1 million homes is feasible in the time frame, but we could certainly be looking at far more than 30,000 homes.
Shana Caspers is urging whoever wins on Saturday to help the next generation.
I don't want to be older and renting.
For her, the Australian dream feels like a mirage.
Amelia Terzon with that report. So will the proposed policies from both major parties help more Australians buy a home, or is it just tinkering around the edges, pushing the Australian dream even further away? AMP senior economist Diana Messina says there are longer-term problems the next government will need to address to solve the housing affordability issue.
Look, I think that some of the measures will be taken quite favourably by the groups that they're targeting. First home buyers and young people will feel very happy that they can potentially get an extra $50,000 to help them with a deposit, because that's the key issue in terms of getting into the housing market. Getting that deposit for first home buyers is extremely difficult. But it does not solve the longer-term issue of affordability in Australia in the housing market, which will take many years to actually solve, I think.
So is the current housing situation a demand issue or a supply problem?
I think over the past few years it's more of a demand problem. We've had the RBA cut interest rates to record lows. We've had a lot of support from the government in terms of fiscal transfers during the pandemic. This has all led to this big increase in demand for housing. And we also had, of course, the home building scheme, which really encouraged people to build new houses or to renovate existing properties. This has led to a huge increase in housing demand at the same time that you have all these incentives in the housing market, like negative gearing, the capital gains tax concession, that encourage investors and owner-occupiers into the housing market here.
So what reforms do you think are necessary to create structural change in the housing sector? What policies should the parties be offering to lower house prices?
There's a few things that are on the table. If the government was to seriously consider long-term changes to affordability across Australia, then they would need to look at changes to negative gearing and capital gains taxes. That doesn't necessarily mean to get rid of the current policies, but it could mean tinkering at the policies at the margin. So, for example, to restrict negative gearing to either new properties or to only limit negative gearing to one property per person or per household. The other issue is, of course, working with the state governments to deal with supply problems. The government has sort of addressed these issues with trying to do more social housing, build to rent, these types of policies, but trying to change some of the zoning requirements, which are an issue with the state governments. This is something that could also be addressed. So there are both demand and supply side solutions, but they take years to actually flow through into housing. At the same time, we've also got a central bank that's raising the cash rate. That will have big implications for housing.
If we can just stay with the demand side of things, with capital gains tax and negative gearing that you just touched on there, is there really any real appetite to change those to bring down property prices, particularly when so much of our economy's success is linked to the property market strength?
I think that that's probably the biggest concern that policymakers have when they want to potentially make changes to these policies. And we saw that at the last election when the Labor government came out with potential changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax. It wasn't taken that favourably by the electorates. I think it needs to be done in a way that doesn't scare people, that doesn't let people think that housing is going to fall by 20 or 30%, because, as you said, most people are leveraged in the housing market. They either own a home, they want to own a home, and it obviously also flows through into the equity market and into people's superannuation. So I think that there can be appetite, because affordability is deteriorating year by year, and it will become more of an issue over the next few years as we see that younger people can't actually afford to be in the housing market in many parts of Australia, predominantly in Sydney and Melbourne, but a huge chunk of the population live in those two capital cities.
The measures that have come out from both major parties, as we mentioned earlier, have been demand-driven measures. You touched on the supply of housing before. We know that the supply of housing rests with the state and territory governments around the country. Can you just tell us a bit more about what they could be doing and what you think they should be doing as part of a solution to the problem, or is it purely demand-driven?
No, I think that supply is still an important issue. We know that, notwithstanding the last few years, in the last 10 to 15 years, there have been serious issues around the supply of housing. Our population has been growing at a very high pace before the pandemic, levels of well over 1% per annum, mainly driven by overseas migration. And we know that when skilled migrants come here, they demand houses, and the building of these new homes just has not kept up with that underlying supply, this big increase in overseas migration. Now, of course, we could be in a period now where overseas migration is going to be lower than where it was before the pandemic, but I think it will still come back up. It will still increase. So we need to figure out through the state and the territory policies how much a population is going to rise over the next few years, do some projections around this, and figure out what type of levels of new housing supply we really need across the country. And this could be done, I think that it really needs to be done over the next few years, and that would help with the supply problems, but I think at the same time, the supply side is not the only solution to the housing issues that we have. The demand side issues of negative gearing and the capital gains tax need to be considered as well.
Diane Messina, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Proof today that extended lockdowns in China are hitting the world's second biggest economy. Unemployment is at its highest level since February 2020. Retail sales were down a staggering 11% last month compared to the previous year. And over the same period, Chinese industrial production fell almost 3% as restrictions paralysed supply chains. A look at the markets now, and the All Ordinaries and the ASX 200 closed up 0.25%, despite the miners taking a hit after those soft numbers out of China. That weakness spread to the Aussie dollar, which has lost ground against the greenback. It's currently trading below 69 cents. I spoke to Gemma Dale from NAB Trade after the market closed. Gemma, what was the reaction to those numbers out of China?
Oh, the ASX was up strongly this morning. It was up about 80 basis points on a really strong lead from the US in particular over the weekend. And then we got those China numbers back and things started to fall away. There's clearly some concern in the market. There was a very significant fall in retail sales, down over 11%. The expectation was around 6%. So that was a very significant contraction relative to what was expected. Industrial production was the real concern, though, for many people. There was an expectation it would actually eke out a bit of a gain year on year, but it fell nearly 3%, down 2.9%. So real concern on the market that will have ongoing ramifications. The expectation is that Shanghai will stage something of a reopening from today, but clearly the data is telling us that things have contracted quite dramatically and there could be longer term impacts.
Well, with regards to those ongoing ramifications, what might it mean for our iron ore exports?
Yeah, it's all about iron ore, isn't it? And it's been all about iron ore for quite some time. We're aware, obviously, that simply getting Chinese workers back to work is going to be a real challenge. Unemployment across 31 cities was at 6.7%, which is extraordinarily high by Chinese standards, and that has a significant impact on the demands for iron ore. But the longer-term outlook is really strong, and when you talk to analysts, expectations are that that's just not going to drift away. Australia still remains the biggest producer in the world, and we are feeding that growth in China. And longer term, the expectation is that will continue, but we have to work through the COVID zero policy and how that's going to play out first.
You mentioned that the Australian market sold off on the Chinese numbers, but how did it end the day and how did the sectors fare?
So it ended up a little higher for the day, about 0.27%. So not falling away completely. Obviously less than thrilled about those Chinese numbers, but there were sectors that held up relatively well. The big corporate news was Brambles. It's been something of a chronic underperformer. Although they're a pallet manufacturer and distributor, they have something like 350 million pallets across 60 countries. There is so much opportunity for that company to do better, according to analysts and certainly many fund managers who hold the stock. So news of not an offer yet, but certainly some potential bid from CVC, which is private equity, where we were expecting to see a bid come from. The company has said that obviously they're open to other offers if they can get one that's going to look better before they open their books and go into deep due diligence. So the market liked that quite a lot. It was up more than 10%, and investors who've been holding on for a long time and suffered a little with that stock are hoping that things will come back.
Gemma Dale, great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that's all from The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. For more on those stories, head to the ABC News website and click on the business page. And you can catch the program anytime on iView. Thanks for your company.
Welcome to this ABC News special. Greg Jennett with you. As hundreds of thousands of Australians go about casting their ballots for the May 21 election, we're giving you a glimpse into one of the largest troves of data collected on the issues and the policies that matter to you. The ABC's Vote Compass has so far clocked almost 1 million responses in election 2022, answers to questions on the broad policy areas felt to be important, and also to more specific questions, which are then used to map where you might stand in relation to the major parties' positions. Now, in a moment, we'll hear from our Vote Compass reporter, Bridget Brennan, who's been trawling through the trends in that trove. First, though, here's Bridget's breakdown of the main topics and concerns nominated by voters as front of mind to them.
Deadly bushfires and devastating floods have left scores of Australians picking up the pieces in the past 3 years. Exacerbated by climate change, it's predicted our natural disasters will intensify as the climate continues to warm.
I think the lived experience that people have had around floods, drought and bushfires has made climate change a front of centre issue for many Australians.
When Vote Compass asked what the most important issue is for voters at this election, more Australians singled out climate change than any other issue. 29% of Australians said climate change was their number one concern. But when we look more closely at voter intention, it's not as clear-cut. Climate change was the top issue for Labor and Greens voters, but it ranked 4th for Liberal National voters. For coalition voters, it wasn't as important as the economy and finance, the cost of living, and defence and security. Labor voters told Vote Compass that after climate change, they're most worried about the cost of living and government accountability. 50% of Greens voters chose climate change as their most pressing issue, followed by the environment and the cost of living.
Coalition voters are clearly much more interested in the economy, they're much more interested in defence, the issues the government is running on, rather than the issues that Labor and the Greens are running on.
The rising cost of living is putting enormous strain on many families, and Vote Compass shows it's now in Australians' top 2 concerns. Ahead of the last election in 2019, it was ranked 11th.
Real wage growth has not gone up for quite some time, probably the best part of 2 decades.
For 2 years, our lives have been dominated by the pandemic, yet COVID didn't make it into Australians' top 10 when Vote Compass asked about your most important issue. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Well, Bridget's briefly brought up there the league ladder of pressing concerns identified by voters. Climate, cost of living and the economy are all there, of course, near the top. But let's bring her back in now for some further analysis. And Bridget, with every passing election, Vote Compass is a deepening vault of data. Can we compare shifts in emphasis on the issues that matter to Australians between 2019, the last election, and this election? What really stands out to you, Bridget?
We certainly can, Greg, and what stands out to me is cost of living. Now, the cost of living is soaring due to many international global factors, and we can see that Australians are deeply concerned about the rising cost of living. In fact, some of the people we spoke to about the Vote Compass data, just everyday Australians, have told us they're struggling to make ends meet like never before. They're struggling to put fuel in their car and put food on the table. And cost of living is now the second concern when we look at the Vote Compass data. Back in 2019, Greg, it was 11th. Can you imagine it being that far down? You know,
the good old days, they might have called those.
Yeah. So back then, people were more interested in the economy and finance, so things like taxation and our finance system. But, I mean, that is still a top issue for a lot of voters, but cost of living has now gone to the second ranking, just below climate change, where 29% of Australians said that would be their top issue at this election. So I think we can really see that that is going to be front and centre for a lot of Australians next weekend.
Yeah, that's a marked shift, to be sure. Now, the pandemic, of course, Bridget, turned society on its head for at least a couple of years, even longer for some of us. How has that altered, or did it in fact alter the prominence of health and of aged care as policies of concern?
Well, when we looked at some of those issues of salience and those top issues that people are concerned about coming into the election, actually COVID was well down. It didn't actually even make it into our top 10, Greg, which is quite interesting given, as you said, it absolutely dominated our television screens and our politics for the past 2 years. Perhaps an indication that we are getting on with things now and we're looking to other issues of concern. However, of course, aged care was a huge talking point for a lot of Australians. It's an issue very relevant to a lot of Australian families. And what we found when we asked people about aged care is that overwhelmingly we want an increase for those workers who work in our aged care homes and in the aged care system. That was one of the recommendations of the Royal Commission into aged care, and Vote Compass shows actually about 82% of Australians either agree strongly or somewhat that the federal government should fund a pay increase. And Greg, Australians aged over 65, about 60% strongly agreed with that pay increase. So that's an issue of concern. Childcare, of course, was free for a little while there, which was fantastic for some families during the pandemic, or many families, I should say. And actually, we also want what we can see from Vote Compass, we also want a larger share to be paid for by the federal government. Now, that differs when you look across party lines, as do all of the issues. There is a partisan split on some of these questions, but we found women were more likely to support a larger share of childcare fees being paid for by the federal government.
Yeah, we might be able to break out some of those points a little later in our coverage. Just finally, national security. China and Solomon Islands, of course, been pretty prominent. Bridget, what does Vote Compass tell us about how prominent that is in the minds of voters?
Well, Greg, one security analyst and expert on foreign aid and China and our relationship with the Asia Pacific said to me, the Vote Compass data actually confirms what experts in this area are saying, which is that Australians' view on China is souring, and quite quickly. It's become obviously a focal point of the federal election campaign, like we haven't seen probably in the last 10 years. And new data from Vote Compass shows that many Australians think the government should actually be taking a harsher line with China. Almost 60% of people said they agreed with that statement, and about 24% were neutral and 12% said they disagreed. So most Australians think we could be taking a stronger stance with China, Greg.
Yeah, and interesting how responsive the parties are to that in their own individual ways. Bridget Brennan, thanks so much for that update.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, well, fuel price surges, housing and even some everyday items like fresh food have all put a pinch on household budgets in recent times. That has made cost of living pressures something that both sides of politics have addressed constantly before and during the 6-week election campaign proper. But who hurts most from price rises? The old, the young, women or men? Well, Vote Compass data offers some insights into that too.
Artist and community worker Kalisha Ivory is making sacrifices to provide for her daughter. The single mum from northwest Tasmania is finding it impossible to secure stable housing, and the rising cost of everyday goods has been terrifying for her.
Until you've had to live off home-brand milk and bread and make sacrifices to put food on the table and fuel in the car, I don't think you can empathise or understand what struggles we go through.
And Kalisha Ivory is not alone.
When Vote Compass asked whether you're more worried about paying the bills compared to this time last year, 45% of Australians said yes, and almost 20% of those voters are much more concerned. And when we break that down for age groups, Australians aged 18 to 29 and 30 to 39 are more likely to be concerned. More than half of 18 to 29-year-olds are much more or somewhat more worried about their ability to pay the bills. And Australian women are 10% more likely than men to be much more worried about making ends meet.
Many Australian households and businesses hit the wall during long lockdowns as COVID spread across the nation. But what about companies that increased their revenues during the pandemic?
Vote Compass asked whether they should pay back any COVID-19 support they received from the government, and most Australians think they should. Close to 80% of voters agree strongly or somewhat that some companies should hand back the money they received as pandemic assistance. And Labor voters were more likely than coalition voters to think that some businesses should pay back money they received via JobKeeper.
To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Well, for 6 weeks now, motorists have been enjoying a 22 cents a litre dip in prices at the Bowser, thanks, of course, to a halving of the fuel excise. Bad news is world oil prices are creeping up again and tax relief comes to an end in September. According to Vote Compass, many wish fuel taxes were lower still. Emily Baker has more on that, as well as responses to questions about COVID and corruption.
We've all been paying more at the petrol pump. For this dad of two, price hikes mean he's less likely to take the car.
We try to avoid now car trips, so you will rather go out for a walk around the block instead of going to a playground in Moncrief or somewhere else.
We asked how much tax you think there should be on petrol.
Based on data from Vote Compass, 43% of Australians wish it was lower. Almost 40% say they're comfortable with where it is now, and fewer than 15% say they want more tax.
The fuel excise has been halved for 6 months in the federal budget. Diane Deshmukh says that's welcome, if a little short-sighted.
Long term, we need to look into different options, I think.
Another big topic this election, COVID-19. The pandemic is still playing out nationwide.
We asked whether the federal government should impose further restrictions to control its spread. According to Vote Compass, 45% of Australians disagree there should be more restrictions. 27% are neutral, but almost 30% want more. That's more common among Australians 65 and older. Last year, Australia Talks told us 9 out of 10 Australians want a federal anti-corruption watchdog. Vote Compass asked how much of a problem you think corruption is in Australia today. The results were overwhelming. 49% of people say it's very much a problem. Another 36% say it's somewhat a problem. Only 1% of people believe it's not a problem at all. And it crosses party lines. 63% of Liberal and National voters say corruption's an issue, as well as about 90% of Labor and Green voters.
To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Well, unemployment's running at historically low levels right now, presenting many people with opportunities for more work. Well, that might be a simple choice if it wasn't for the costs incurred by doing more work. Childcare's a classic example, often wiping out any incentive for women in particular to do more hours. The answer, well, expressed through Vote Compass at least, is a strong desire for more assistance with childcare fees.
It was a major but temporary relief measure at the beginning of the pandemic. Free childcare for all was widely celebrated, but it didn't last.
We have to juggle 2 incomes to survive, and there's not really many other options.
Childcare fees can be a major hit to many families' budgets at a time when the cost of living is soaring. For the Telford family in Western Sydney, childcare is costing tens of thousands of dollars each year.
I'm basically stressed every fortnight just trying to make sure that I've got enough money to pay the daycare bills and meet our mortgage requirements.
It's a difficult financial balancing act for Kylie Telford. If she picks up extra hours as an ICU nurse, the childcare rebate is reduced and it's not worth it financially.
Unless you're really on top of the ball all the time, you might get caught out.
When Vote Compass asked what share of childcare costs should be paid for by the federal government, almost 60% of voters say the government should be paying somewhat more or much more towards childcare fees. And Australian women were more likely than men to support the government paying a bigger share of fees. A quarter of women say the government could be paying much more. And it was 18 to 29-year-olds and 30 to 39-year-olds who were more likely to support the government paying increased subsidies.
The next government really does need to act very quickly. 1, on lifting the subsidy, but 2, on making sure that those really important educators and teachers within the early childhood workforce are coming through the system.
Aside from the cost of childcare, whichever party forms the next government will also need to deal with a critical shortage of educators. To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Standards of aged care have been a blight on the nation through the last few years, more so after the findings of the Royal Commission. At its core, especially through the pandemic, is a chronic shortage of workers, and those who do provide the care are among the lowest paid in the country. Now, the Fair Work Commission is considering a bid for a hefty pay rise, but arguments persist over who'd pick up the tab when that decision's handed down. The coalition's a little opaque on the split between government and providers. Labor's committed to funding any increase. Here's what the survey found on what voters reckon. Emily Baker reports.
During the day, Carlton Williams works in aged care, providing support to people in their homes. It's a job he loves, but one that doesn't pay particularly well. So at night and on weekends, he works at a local pub.
I get paid more to pour drinks, take out food and wait tables than I do sometimes to, like, I guess, look after someone's life.
Vote Compass asked whether the federal government should commit to funding a pay increase for aged care workers. More than 80% of voters say yes. There was support across voting intention, although that was stronger among Labor and Green voters. Women were more likely to agree. And while it was common among all age groups, sentiment was strongest amongst older Australians.
We're talking about roughly 200,000 Australian workers who are looking to get a relatively significant increase. The union movement would like them to get about 25%.
Unlike other parts of your body, you're likely to pick up the entire bill when it comes to looking after your teeth. Only a small number of Australians receive help through the public system, and wait times are usually long.
Vote Compass asked whether Medicare should offer basic dental care to all Australians. The vast majority of Australians believe it should. Voters earning less than $1,000 a week were most likely to agree, and people are more supportive now than when we last asked in 2013.
Over the last couple of years, there's been this big discussion every day about public health, about prevention and things like that. And so I think that's why the public has come around.
Tell us what you think and see where you sit on the political spectrum. Go online and fill out Vote Compass yourself.
Crafting questions that are sharp, relevant, but not politically leading is almost a science in itself behind the Vote Compass process that's been running in several countries over the last decade or so. To provide as much rigour, accuracy and neutrality, expert input is sought along the way. Sydney University academic Peter Chen, who we just caught a sneak peek of in Emily's summary, was part of that process, and we spoke to him a little earlier. Well, Peter Chen, what's politics and media university academics' role in overseeing the Vote Compass survey process?
I worked with the Vote Compass team as an academic advisor. So the Vote Compass team is based at the ABC and involves ABC staff, but also a contractor, Vox Pop Labs, which is based in Canada, and they did a lot of the research work and also the technical work in designing the interface. And the various academic advisors who were brought in looked at the various questions that were being proposed, created a number of questions that were asked in the survey that's administered to participants. And we were also involved in looking at some of the responses that political parties gave to the questions that are asked in the instrument there. Because at times, the researchers would flag things that the parties had said or published, but the parties would respond slightly differently. We adjudicated that material. So we worked to basically ensure that the process had a little bit of oversight externally from the ABC, and we made some recommendations about things to include within the survey itself.
So, Peter, how many questions does it take to make a fair assessment of someone's political position?
I think that's actually a really difficult question because the way in which people respond to politics and to elections is extremely variable. And researchers in the social sciences have demonstrated that there is a huge spectrum of the way in which people think about politics. And elections themselves are very complex and difficult decision-making opportunities for people. If you think about it, we ask voters to do three things when they decide on their vote. We ask them to think about policy issues that are important to themselves, their family, their community, where they sit and where the respective parties sit. But we also ask them to assess the performance of the previous government and to assess the likely performance of a range of alternative governments that might be formed, and taking all that information together, create two decisions, a lower house vote and an upper house vote. So in a way, it is obviously very, very difficult, if not impossible, for people to make a completely rational and reasonable decision in that regards. And so what we find is that different people make different sorts of decisions. Some people using the maxim that the best guide to future performance is past performance, spend a lot of time looking at how did the government perform, how did the opposition perform when it was in government the last time, and they make an assessment based on that performance about how well they think government will operate in the future and base their decision on that.
All right, so how do you gauge then what issues might resonate most with voters?
I think one of the interesting things that was included in the Vote Compass this election cycle was the ability for participants to put in a free text sort of way, an unstructured way, a list of issues that were important to them in that election. And based on hundreds of thousands of those responses, the Vote Compass team used artificial intelligence to analyse those and recategorise them together. And that gives the kind of list of issues that Vote Compass participants identified as of interest to them. Now, the advantage of that approach, as opposed to providing a preset list of topics, which you can reorder or you can select a number off, is that it captures what's on the top of people's mind. It's unprompted recall. And clearly, when people are voting, they're going to vote about things that are on their mind, not necessarily about an artificial list that's provided to them. So that approach is kind of interesting, but also I think what it demonstrates is that it does show that the Vote Compass results will be a little different to other research that's done where public opinion companies might poll people and provide them a preset list and ask them to order them.
Peter Chen from Sydney University, thanks for joining us tonight. You're watching an ABC News special picking through the data gathered by Vote Compass this election, with around 1 million responses sent in online so far. Now, Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have sparred often over who'd be best to manage China, regional relations and national security. Vote Compass reveals many voters think Australia could actually be even tougher in its approach towards China, while also spending more on defence and foreign aid.
Australia's increasingly heated relationship with China has become a focal point of the campaign. Foreign policy and our influence in the Pacific is now a key measure of effective leadership alongside domestic issues.
Vote Compass asked whether you think Australia should take a tougher stance when dealing with China. More than half of Australians want our government to take a stronger position on China. That reflects a relatively robust view across party lines, but it was coalition voters who strongly agreed that Australia should take a more strident approach when dealing with China. But about a quarter of voters were neutral on the question of how to manage our increasingly fraught relationship with China.
We know that the Australian public has soured on China. There isn't really a public mood for significant change in the relationship with China.
Our level of foreign aid, especially towards our Pacific neighbours, has also been in the headlines after the Solomon Islands signed a security arrangement with China.
When Vote Compass asked how much Australia should spend on foreign aid, 45% of voters told us there could be somewhat more or even much more spent on foreign aid. Labor and Greens voters were more likely to support increased aid, but most Liberal National voters disagreed, saying the current foreign aid budget was about right or could be less.
And certainly these results show to me that there's a lot more room for the Australian government to be ambitious on the development program.
And on the question of defence spending, around a third of you told Vote Compass that current defence spending is about right. Close to 40% of voters said it could be higher.
Perhaps an indication that Australians are becoming increasingly more alert to our position in what could be a volatile region.
To tell us what you think and find out how your views align with those of Australia's political parties, visit Vote Compass online and fill out the survey yourself.
Cutting carbon emissions remains a goal for a majority of Australians, no matter which way they intend to vote. From that come more questions about how much people are personally prepared to pay themselves if it came to that. Vote Compass has asked those questions, with the sample weighted to reflect the Australian population.
When it comes to reducing her family's carbon footprint,
Catherine Patterson knows every little bit counts. She's renovated her home to be more energy efficient, installed solar panels and composts where she can.
We also try and reduce waste around the house, and we do that by trying to consume a bit less. A lot of the furniture I have in my house is bought second-hand.
Catherine works for an environmental charity. She says governments of all levels should show leadership in cutting emissions.
And I think that would help people know that they're working on it and, you know, that something's being done. And I think that would probably incentivise a lot of people to do things as well.
Vote Compass asked how much Australia should do to reduce its carbon emissions. The results were overwhelming. 79% of Australians think we should do more, almost 60% of those saying much more. Only 7% of Australians think we should do less. When we break that down along voting intentions, there's still majority support among coalition voters, but support is much stronger among people who vote for Labor, the Greens, and those who say they're voting for independents or other parties.
I think there has been a significant change in what we call the salience, the importance to which voters attribute the issue.
Vote Compass also asked how much you'd be willing to personally pay. 24% of people said between $100 and $500. 20% said $500 to $1,000. 15% said nothing at all.
That is really the big test of whether people see the issue as significant enough that they will, quote unquote, put their money where their mouth is.
Vote Compass asked whether Australia should stop exporting coal to other countries to be used for electricity. It's a polarising issue. About 1/3 of voters said they disagreed. Half agreed, 17% were neutral. Have your say and see where you sit on the political spectrum this election. Go online and fill out Vote Compass yourself.
I'm Greg Jennett. Thanks for your company.
Gruen Nation is back.
Separating the ScoMos from the elbows, you can call me Ando, but not Undo.
Cutting through the clutter of election advertising.
To prove he won't be a PM that turns everything into a photo shoot, Elbows appeared in a series of photo shoots. If he loses the election, Taracash just found their next model.
Gruen Nation.
Oh, I know what I'm voting for in the hottest 100!
Wednesday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
How about you come on a journey with us?
You with me, guys?
Let's conquer the world.
Wow.
I decided to stand up last night and I'll continue to stand up.
We'll be braver and smarter and stronger in love.
Who is brave? Yes.
We'll be seekers and finders and rise to the top.
We're all okay and we're going to be okay.
I'm getting quite emotional.
Gets your heart racing.
Turned into such a crier.
We're going to understand racism. You are pioneers.
I'm on my quest for true love. Yay!
On the home straight, the leaders fight it out over housing policy.
They think it's their money to tell you what to do with. I believe it's your money.
This is an attack on future savings. It's an attack on future generations.
The first witness in Chris Dawson's murder trial gives evidence against her former neighbour. Ukraine buoyed by wins on and off the battlefield. And cricket fans pay tribute to Andrew Symonds. This is ABC Late News. Hello, I'm Michael Tetlow. Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have finally locked themselves into a head-to-head contest for votes, with rival policies for first home buyers front and centre. What the coalition calls its game-changer idea to let people dip into their superannuation has become a red line issue for Labor, which warns it's a threat to the nation's retirement savings system. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
Scott Morrison's re-election gamble on bricks and mortar.
Getting the deposit is the hardest part.
The Prime Minister promoting his plan to allow first home buyers early access to their superannuation.
So they don't have to stand on the curb and watch house prices run away from them.
Scott Morrison will bulldoze your super and push up house prices.
Oh my God! In an election campaign of relatively few policy contests,
See that second slip?
the battle over housing is as hot as the property market's been. The coalition scheme would see first home buyers dip into their superannuation, capped at 40% or $50,000. Labor's policy would see the government take an equity stake in the home of low and modest income earners, also capped at 40%. But when the property is sold, the contribution plus a share of any capital gain would either go back into super or back to the government.
It's your money and it should be your home. But the master planning on this development.
Both schemes would require a deposit, 5% under the coalition, 2% under Labor.
I know the benefit of a secure roof over your head. It's my life.
But both policies run the risk of inflating house prices, a minister admitting as much about the coalition's proposal.
I would imagine in the short term you might see a bump in house prices.
Minister Hume belled the cat this morning.
When you look at the proportion of first home buyers of the entire real estate market, it's quite marginal.
The rival housing policies highlighting the ideological split over superannuation.
This is an attack on future savings. It's an attack on future generations.
What could possibly be wrong with letting Australians use their own savings to buy the most important asset they will ever own in their lives?
Labor's been so keen to keep the focus on Scott Morrison, it's matched many coalition policies over the past few weeks. By drawing the line on super for housing, Anthony Albanese gives his opponent the fight he so clearly wants. The PM says it's about individual choice and aspiration. For Labor, it's about defending a totemic economic policy, a philosophical scrap that'll be decided in 5 days. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
So while political leaders battle out their differences, aspiring homeowners are working out which policy is more likely to help them break into the housing market. But there are warnings neither will help with housing affordability.
Shana Caspers wants to raise Isla in their own home.
I would like somewhere for my daughter to grow up and have childhood memories in for, 20 years.
But Shana is not so desperate to buy that she'd tap into her nest egg.
My super is for when I'm old. It's not for me to go and buy a house.
The Coalition's plan to let first home buyers use some of their super for a home loan is getting mixed reactions.
Affordable housing is such an issue, but so is retirement savings.
It would be good in some circumstances as long as it doesn't bid up the price of housing.
It's a great opportunity for people to get into the market right now where they can make equity.
But analysts say that most young Australians don't have enough super to take advantage from this policy.
The scheme is probably more advantageous for wealthy Australians who have more money in their super.
The Coalition's proposal sits on top of the existing first home loan deposit scheme. Labor is backing that one too, and its own alternative proposal is a shared equity scheme where the Commonwealth co-owns your property with you. Economists are warning that none of these schemes will actually reduce prices.
If you pour more fuel on a fire, it gets hotter. This is more money going into a finite set of houses for sale.
When it comes to supply, the Coalition and Labor both want to fund around 30,000 new homes for social housing, while the Greens have a more ambitious idea.
I don't know if the Greens policy of 1 million homes is feasible in the time frame, but we could certainly be looking at far more than 30,000 homes.
Shana Caspers is urging whoever wins on Saturday to help the next generation.
I don't want to be older and renting.
For her, the Australian dream feels like a mirage. Amelia Terzon, ABC News.
The first witness in the Chris Dawson murder trial has told a Sydney court his wife Lynette was a loving mother who would never have abandoned her children. The former Sydney schoolteacher is charged with killing her in 1982. He claims she left of her own accord.
At the time of the alleged murder, Julie Andrew lived next to the Dawsons in Bayview on Sydney's northern beaches. She described Lynette Dawson as a close friend who doted on her children. She was very caring, very loving, very tender. She was more patient than I was. She was an inspiration. A month before Lynette disappeared, Ms Andrews said she witnessed an altercation. I heard a wailing, a loud crying. Lynn was backed up against the trampoline by Chris. He was towering over her and he had at least one hand on her shoulder. Lynette was upset, she said, because the 16-year-old babysitter was moving in. I said, Lynn, you can't have her move in here. He's the babysitter. They were my exact words. Ms Andrew told the court that in the weeks following Lynette's disappearance, she began to suspect something bad had happened. I waited for someone to say, she's gone. Where is she? Why didn't someone come and ask me? No one asked me, and to my great regret and shame, I never did anything about it. She insisted Ms Dawson would not have run away. She would never have left those children behind. Under cross-examination, Julie Andrew admitted that she did not accept that there was even a slight possibility that Chris Dawson could be innocent. The defence put it to her that she was embellishing her evidence in order to ensure a conviction and suggested that she was flattered by the celebrity status afforded to her for her role in The Teacher's Pet, a podcast about the case. Lynette Dawson's sister, Patricia Jenkins, appeared briefly today. Her evidence will continue tomorrow. Ruby Cornish, ABC News, Sydney.
It's been a shocking year for fans of cricket. First the deaths of Rod Marsh and Shane Warne, now Andrew Symonds. On the field he was a giant, freakishly gifted and capable of single-handedly swinging a match. But to the people who knew him off, he was humble and always willing to lend a hand.
An innings cut short for a hometown hero. A roadside memorial to mark the magic of Andrew Symonds.
It feels like it just happened in my backyard.
He's true blue, isn't he? So, yeah, we'll miss him.
Across the globe, sporting royalty lined up to praise the prodigious talent of the man affectionately known as Roy.
We're just lucky to have had him, play our game because he changed the game a little bit, particularly one-day cricket with his power hitting.
And when you're playing sport, there's good days, there's bad days, but having Roy around almost made it good.
On the Gold Coast, tributes were laid at Bill Pippin Oval, where former Dolphins teammates say he was loved both on and off the field.
He's like the Crocodile Dundee version of cricket. He loved his fishing and his hunting, but I guess on the flip side of that, he could just hit a cricket ball and play the game of cricket very well.
In his North Queensland hometown, a spontaneous tribute, Rod's out for Roy, a nod to the local legend who spent much of his retirement claiming catches of a different kind. Yet he still made a point of helping up-and-coming athletes.
If he could fit something in or do something for you, he would do it.
But keen to dismiss any praise for his random yet consistent acts of kindness.
I remember I was in a bad place and he dropped off a couple of mud crabs and some beers.
It was here in Charters Towers where it all began for the elite sportsman who earned a string of accolades on the running track, in the swimming pool and, of course, on the cricket pitch. And while his talent sent him far and wide, he never forgot his North Queensland roots.
Andrew was always generous with his time. If he was asked, he was a guest speaker or guest of honour at a formal dinner occasion, giving of his time for one-on-one interviews with students.
Leaving a legacy that transcended sporting codes, but one that's left the cricketing world hurting again, just months after the deaths of Rod Marsh and Shane Warne.
Maybe the great man in the sky is putting together a cricket team.
Jade Toomey, ABC News, Townsville.
The chief of NATO says Ukraine could win the war with the Russian invasion not going to plan. Ukraine says its troops defending the city of Kharkiv have advanced all the way to the Russian border. After months of shelling and occupation, residents in the region are starting to think about recovery. Europe correspondent Steve Kinane reports from the village of Malarogan.
Malarogan was a peaceful hamlet just 30 kilometres from Russian territory. Full of Russian speakers, it was a village with close links to its northern neighbours. Ties irretrievably destroyed by Putin's brutal invasion. The Russians seized Yulia's house and turned it into an observation post before trashing it on their way out.
They brought grief and destruction. We were living a happy life here. They destroyed everything in a second.
But the Ukrainians fought back, taking trenches, destroying tanks, and wiping out this warehouse that had been commandeered and used to store ammunition. Just like in the battle for Kiev, the Ukrainians drove the Russians out of the villages they'd occupied.
Why did Russians come here? Because they thought that they would be welcomed with salt and bread.
Welcome, Russia.
Now the Ukrainian military are helping these communities return to the liberated areas and making sure these villages are now safe.
When you walk down this street, you can see the absolute destruction inflicted on this village by Russian forces. And there's also what you don't see. The local military are telling us that this area, this village, was left booby-trapped and it was left mined. So when civilians came back to their homes, there were bombs inside their electronic equipment, inside their furniture.
The Ukrainians are deeply thankful for the military aid the West has been sending, including the Bushmaster vehicles sent by Australia.
Thank you very much for all Australian people for Bushmasters. It's very nice machine, and my military brothers very cool in Bushmaster and push racism home.
Soon these villages will need a different type of aid when they begin to rebuild these war-ravaged communities. Steve Kinane, ABC News, Malarogan.
NATO says it's confident Turkey won't delay membership of Finland and Sweden to the military alliance. Foreign ministers from NATO's 30 member states have been holding informal talks in Germany as the two countries take firm steps to join. Turkey has accused Sweden and Finland of supporting Kurdish militant groups in their territory, but the NATO Secretary-General says he's confident they'll be able to reach a consensus.
Turkey has made it clear that their intention is not to block membership, and therefore I'm confident that we will be able to address the concerns that Turkey has expressed in a way that doesn't delay the membership or the accession process.
Moscow has threatened retaliation if NATO weapons are deployed close to Russia in Finland. New details are emerging about the teenage gunman who killed 10 people at a supermarket in New York State. He was taken into custody a year ago after making threats at his high school, but was released after a mental health check. He's now been charged with first-degree murder. North America correspondent Carrington Clark reports from Buffalo.
A day after the horrific attack, the community of Buffalo, New York, is trying to comprehend what they've lost.
We came out here because my little brother's birthday was yesterday. He was turning 3 years old. My dad came to the store to grab him a birthday cake, and he cashed out, but he never made it out the store. And now our life will never be the same again.
He was one of 10 people killed when an 18-year-old opened fire in a supermarket, live streaming it on social media. It's been revealed a day before the attack, the white teenager drove to Buffalo from his home several hours away to do reconnaissance. Police say they're in no doubt the attack on the largely black neighbourhood was an act of racially motivated violent extremism.
Father, we need you. We must all work together to address the hate that remains a stain on the soul of America.
A year ago, the gunman was taken by police to hospital after threatening to carry out a shooting at his high school. He was given a mental health evaluation and then released shortly after. The police are continuing to gather evidence at the crime scene here. Part of the investigation is focused on the suspect's online behaviour. This tragic incident is once again raising questions about whether the tech giants are doing enough to combat hate speech.
I want them to sit in a room, look me in the eye and tell me, have you done everything humanly possible to make sure that you are monitoring this content the second it hits your platform?
This tight-knit community has only just begun dealing with the devastating consequences of being the target of a hate-filled teenager with a gun. Carrington Clark, ABC News, Buffalo, New York.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un says his country is in a state of great turmoil days after admitting it's in the grip of a coronavirus outbreak. Kim has deployed his military to stabilise the supply of medication in the capital, Pyongyang. The government says drugs procured by the state are not reaching people in a timely manner, and many people lack an understanding of the Omicron variant and the correct treatment method. It's believed the population of 26 million people are mostly unvaccinated after the government rejected vaccine supplies from the global program COVAX. North Korea today reported 8 new deaths and nearly 400,000 more people with a fever. Queen Elizabeth has attended the final day of this year's Royal Windsor Horse Show. The 96-year-old monarch was driven into the outdoor spectacle, which kicked off celebrations to mark her 70 years on the throne. The Queen has only been seen in public on a few occasions since spending a night in a hospital last October for an unspecified illness. She's attended every Royal Windsor Horse Show since its inception 79 years ago. Ensuring residents in remote areas across Australia can have their say in the federal election is a huge logistical challenge. Reporter Mitchell Abram travelled to the remote Central Australian community of Santa Teresa, where the voter turnout has been historically low.
The vast electorate of Lingiari covers almost the entire Northern Territory, leaving out Darwin and most of its satellite city Palmerston. This includes more than 70 remote communities, from the desert to the tropics, and making sure everyone has their say at election time can be a challenge.
We've got 16 teams roaming right across the Northern Territory, 1.3 million square kilometres delivering the vote to these remote communities.
On a cool morning in the community of Ginger Porter, also known as Santa Teresa, locals queue to cast their vote at a polling centre set up by one of the Australian Electoral Commission's remote voting teams.
It's a good chance for our people to vote.
The community is a rough and dusty 1-hour drive from Alice Springs, but getting to many of the other communities across Lingiari isn't so straightforward.
The exercise is huge. The logistics that we have to go through to get to some of these communities, we send teams out by boats, 4-wheel drives, planes, helicopters, any which means we can, just to try and help people have their vote.
Travelling the extreme distances of the Northern Territory is challenge enough for the remote voting teams, but they also have to cater for the many different languages spoken throughout the Territory.
We have a number of resources that the AEC has developed over the years, and they've been developed in the local languages, which we can hand out to voters as they come in, and they're on an iPad in their local language, their first mother tongue.
They're also reaching out to locals like Raymond Palmer, who volunteered to help interpret. He says he wants to help residents make their vote count and encourage the next generation of voters.
Melbourne.
After a dismal start to the NRL season, Trent Barrett has stood down as head coach of the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. Barrett resigned last night off the back of the Bulldogs' 10-point loss to Newcastle at the weekend. Under Barrett, the Bulldogs have won just 5 out of 34 games. Despite a massive recruitment drive this season, Canterbury is bottom of the ladder, having won 2 matches after 10 rounds.
Well, it's Trent's decision. I mean, certainly I wasn't going to sack him. It's sad that it's come to this, but I think just the performances and the pressure, and he just got to the feeling that probably he didn't have the solution to what was going wrong.
The Bulldogs plan to appoint an interim coach in the next...
Got to the feeling that probably he didn't have the solution to what was going wrong.
The Bulldogs plan to appoint an interim coach in the next 24 hours ahead of Friday night's clash with the Tigers. Matilda's captain Sam Kerr has scored 2 goals to help Chelsea beat Manchester City 3-2 in the FA Cup final at Wembley. Kerr opened the scoring in the 33rd minute in front of a crowd of 49,000. Her Matilda's teammate Hayley Rasso found an equaliser in the 89th minute to send the game into extra time before Kerr scored the match winner.
Sam Kerr goes for goal! Finds the goal! Big deflection!
I don't really care how they go in, honestly. I thought the first one I had to make sure it went over the line, and the second one we got lucky, but that's what football's about.
Kerr also scored twice in Chelsea's FA Cup victory last year. It's the second year in a row the Blues have won both the FA Cup and the Super League title. Australian Minjie Lees won the Founders Cup in New Jersey to claim her first victory of the year on the US Tour. The world number 5 had a 2-under par 70 to finish 2 shots ahead of American Lexi Thompson. It was the 25-year-old's first triumph since winning her maiden major title in July last year. The future of Australian car rally races on tarmac is in doubt after a bombshell decision by Motorsport Australia. The authority is suspending Targa rallies pending an investigation into the latest in a series of deadly crashes at Targa, Tasmania.
They're fast, they're exciting, but not without danger. Now Targa rallies hang in the balance as the body in charge reviews the events.
It's pretty disappointing as a competitor, but someone as well who obviously invests a lot of money into it.
A string of fatal crashes at Targa, Tasmania, now putting that event and others in Queensland and Victoria on hold. Motorsport Australia, which sanctions and insures the events, suspending permits for rally competitions.
While many competitors acknowledge that motorsport is dangerous, we cannot accept that death is an outcome of competition, as has been suggested to us.
Brisbane driver Tony Seymour was killed at this year's Targa, Tasmania. That came despite increased safety standards in the wake of 3 deaths last year.
It's very sad for everyone involved, but you know, the overwhelming response from the group is that the show should go on.
I really hope that if Motorsport Australia can't back the event, that perhaps another company will in the future.
Motorsports Australia is conducting its own investigation into this year's fatal crash and a wider review of tarmac rallies. While that takes place, it says Targa events can still go ahead in a non-competitive touring style, with competitors sticking to local speed limits. Damien McIntyre, ABC News.
Time now for the weather with Paul Higgins.
Well, heading into tomorrow, more unseasonable rain will move into the Pilbara and push further into the interior. And there is, in fact, a warning of heavy rainfall. A low and trough will approach the southwest. More showers and gusty winds for Tasmania, and a weak trough over southeast Queensland will bring a shower or two there. Otherwise, it should be dry. A chance of showers about Queensland's northeast tropical coast and south of a line from Mackay to Hughenden. Showers in the southeast. In Brisbane, they'll be there in the afternoon. Sunny across New South Wales, apart from a shower or two on the far north coast and also the southwest slopes of the ranges. Sunny, but it will be cooler in Sydney and mostly sunny in Canberra. Scattered showers over Victoria's southwest coast will spread to the rest of the southwest and along the coast in the afternoon. Dry in Melbourne until evening showers. Windy over Tasmania with showers, especially over the west, far south and far north. Snow down to 800 metres, a shower or two for Hobart. In South Australia, a shower or two just about the southern agricultural area, the far northwest. Scattered showers about the Mount Lofty ranges and also the lower southeast, a shower or two on the way for Adelaide. In the west, showers over the southwest land division, Goldfields, the southern and coastal Gascoyne and eastern Eucla. Rain and thunderstorms over the northern Gascoyne, Pilbara and interior. Evening showers coming up in Perth. And then in the Territory, an afternoon shower or two over the western Lassiter district, especially near the Western Australian border, but a sunny day for Darwin.
Thanks, Paul. That is ABC Late News to the moment. I'm Michael Tetlow from the team. Thanks very much for your company. Take care and bye for now.
Welcome to the program. The Prime Minister enters the final week of the election campaign with the coalition behind in the polls and pledging to remake himself if re-elected. Shortly, I'll speak to Scott Morrison in one of his most important interviews of the campaign. But first, here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle.
What Australians have needed from me going through this pandemic has been strength and resilience. Now, I admit that hasn't enabled Australians to see a lot of other gears in the way I work. I know Australians know that I can be a bit of a bulldozer when it comes to issues, and I suspect you guys know that too.
For a Prime Minister who prides himself as one who is not for turning, Friday was a significant day. There was the concession that he could, indeed would, change. He talked of being a bit of a bulldozer in terms of his approach to the pandemic and to matters of national security. But, staring at a likely election defeat, his problem is that polling suggests voters, and particularly female voters, don't see him so much as a bulldozer, but as a bully.
Mr. Speaker, she can go.
I think it's one of the worst acts of bullying I've ever witnessed.
I describe him as like a menacing, controlling wallpaper.
Lacking the moral compass and having no conscience.
A bulldozer wrecks things. A bulldozer knocks things over. I'm a builder. That's what I am.
I know there are things that are going to have to change with the way I do things, because we're moving into a different time. I'll need some more time and training on this one.
All the signs on Friday were of a political party and a government in full-scale panic mode, throwing out the disciplined playbook, but clearing the way for the campaign launch yesterday.
I had one focus as your Prime Minister: save the country. And we did. And we did.
The Prime Minister also tried to smooth over the more lethal charges made by the opposition, and which show up all the time in voter comments. That Morrison has been too often missing in action, most notoriously holidaying in Hawaii while Australia burned, and that he too often blames others when things go wrong.
And while others were criticising, we just worked feverishly to turn it around and make up the ground.
The Prime Minister celebrated the largest economic and public health response in Australia's history. But that overlooked controversies over the oversight of nursing homes, the vaccine rollout, the availability of rapid antigen tests, pressure on states to open their borders, and the seemingly constant need to bring in Defence forces to fill the gaps in our health and aged care systems exposed by the pandemic.
We weren't perfect, and not everything went to plan.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister was focused instead on the economic bounce back from the pandemic.
Back in March 2020, our nation was gripped by fear and uncertainty. We stood on the edge of an abyss.
And now, he says, we are standing on a much less precarious edge.
We stand on the edge of a new era of opportunity. Better days are now ahead.
The central pledges made yesterday to deliver those better days concerned housing affordability. Most significantly, there was a pledge to let first home buyers get early access to their superannuation. The policy has not been universally welcomed, with claims that it would have a negative impact on both the housing market and on superannuation. According to many economists, and even Superannuation Minister Jane Hume, the policy will fuel further house price rises.
We are seeing housing values still rising on a national basis, but we have seen the larger markets like Sydney and Melbourne starting to edge into the early phase of a downturn. If you start to provide an easier way for people to get into the marketplace, at least in raising a deposit, then clearly that's going to have some upside to housing demand.
This is like throwing kerosene on a bonfire. The expectation is that it would increase the cost of a home here in Sydney by $134,000.
There is a considerable wedge in this announcement. Rating superannuation is one issue which Labor, which sees itself as the builder and defender of the super system, will not copy. And the policy is designed to contrast with Labor's plan, which sees a government subsidy to low-income households paid back in the form of a share of the capital gain when the property is sold. But the political threshold question is whether the policy actually would make much difference to many people. The average superannuation balance of the 30 to 40-year-old age bracket that is likely to benefit from the government scheme is $80,000, meaning that, at best, with a cap of a 40% drawdown, they would only be able to get $32,000 towards their house purchase. There are two reasons why 35 years ago, giving big tax concessions to superannuation was regarded as good public policy. The first was a personal good. a reward for locking money away and ensuring individuals would have a decent retirement income. The second was a public good. If an ageing population accumulated retirement savings, the drag on the budget of a ballooning age pensions bill would not be overwhelming. But Labor links all issues back to voters' dislike of Scott Morrison and says this late policy announcement, after the coalition has been in office for a decade, is a product of political desperation.
I think a lot of Australians will form the view over the next few days and on Saturday that it's time to fire the liar.
I'm seeking a second term because I'm just warming up.
The Prime Minister's in Cairns this evening. Prime Minister, thank you very much for your time.
Happy, Lee. Happy to.
How do you campaign effectively when even you are admitting that the biggest drag on the government's re-election chance is yourself?
Because we've got the economic plan, Lee, that I know can take Australia into the future and seize the opportunities there. I know that's the case. I know our economic plan is working because Australians are working. We've been through one of the most difficult times the country has seen in generations, since the Great Depression, and we've been able to come through getting unemployment down, bringing the economy through, and now we are setting up for the opportunities ahead, investing in the skills, investing in the infrastructure, getting taxes down, businesses investing in their equipment to set themselves up for the opportunity. That opportunity's there, and our economic plan can achieve that, which means we can pay for Medicare, we can pay for the aged care reforms, we can pay for the defence forces that we need in a highly uncertain and unstable environment.
I'll come to the economy and jobs shortly in detail, but just firstly, how did you conclude that the thing that people don't like about you is that you're a bulldozer?
Well, I'm just being honest, Lee. I mean, I can be. And during the last 2 or 3 years, but frankly at other times in the various jobs that I've had, that has been very necessary. I mean, Australia has been able to come through this pandemic in a situation where our economy is stronger than all of the G7 countries. We've got one of the lowest death rates in the world, and that didn't happen by accident. It required great will, great determination, tremendous strength, and be able to push through. Now, we're going into a new period now.
Sorry, Prime Minister, just to pick up though. I'm just wondering though why you think that any of that is the kind of thing that upsets people, because if you look at what the focus groups are saying, isn't the feedback more that people don't like what they perceive, rightly or wrongly, as you ducking responsibility, blame shifting, being slippery with the truth, being slow to act when required?
Well, they're Labor's criticisms, and that's not what I get. What I get is people really just want to see me be more inclusive in terms of how I go forward, and I think that's the challenge going forward, and that's what we want to do. During the course of a crisis and a pandemic, you've got to move fast, you've got to be decisive, and that means sometimes you can't take everybody with you, and you don't always get everything right either. But in the next phase, then we've got the opportunity to bring people forward on that plan, and it's a plan that I know is working, and that's the key, because the plan depends on knowing what you're talking about on the economy, having the experience, and to apply the lessons of these last difficult years to ensure we realise those opportunities in the future so Australians can realise their aspirations, like owning a home.
You've spoken about things that you would do differently. What would you have done differently, for example, when it came to the way your government used community sports grants as a slush fund to channel money to marginal seats?
Well, I completely reject that, Lee.
Well, that was the finding of the Australian National Audit Office.
No, I'm sorry. Every place I've gone where we've continued to provide support for local clubs, these clubs matter in these communities.
Yeah, but
I don't think public servants... I'm sorry, Lee. I was just going to finish. I don't think public servants sitting in Canberra have a better idea about what people need in their communities than their members of parliament who work in those communities every day.
Sport Australia might, and the National Audit Office found that half of the successful projects weren't the ones recommended by Sport Australia, they were ones that went to marginal seats.
Well, and I'm sorry, politicians, elected leaders, ministers ultimately make decisions because we're the ones who are accountable to the public, not public servants, not Sport Australia. I mean, I was at the Beauty Point bowling club down in northern Tasmania the other day. That's the main community hall in the entire community. It's a bowls club. They needed help to ensure that they could continue. We're supporting them. Now, someone in Canberra mightn't understand how important that is, but I can tell you what they do, and Bridget Archer does, and I do, And that's why we support it. So I just don't buy into this narrative that is put to us. Politicians, members of parliament, are part of their local community. They know what their community needs. We go to an election, we are very clear about what we plan to do and the commitments we make, and then we follow through and we implement them.
This is a 9-year-old government, and in a term that long, a government has a record of things that it's initiated and a record of things unexpected to which it's had to react. So let's start with what you've initiated. You've racked up trillions of dollars in debt. What does Australia have to show for it that's a lasting change for the better?
We're building Snowy Hydro. We're building the Western Sydney Airport. We're building the Inland Rail. We've completed the duplication of the Pacific Highway. We've boosted the Bruce. But importantly, we have an economy today on the other side of a pandemic because of the single largest economic intervention in Australia's history. Before we went into the into the pandemic, we actually balanced the budget. It took us 6 years to get there. And we did it not by cutting services, we did it by growing the economy. Now, that meant we had deficits for those years, and those deficits added to the debt. But are you suggesting we should have been cutting hospitals and schools and things like that to get there? We said we wouldn't do that. We said we would balance the budget by growing the economy. Now, I was Treasurer for 3 of those years, and we went into the pandemic. We balanced the budget, which meant we could respond with JobKeeper, the cash flow boost, the tax incentives, the COVID supplements, all of these things, and record spending on health to get Australia through the biggest crisis we'd faced in 70 years. I would say that's a lot to show for it. We have a country today which is strong.
As you mentioned, you were clawing back that debt over a period of time, and you were elected in 2013 on that promise, as you would remember. Now you're campaigning for re-election with record debt, and we're not hearing a word about a plan to pay it back.
Well, it's the same plan. By growing your economy and being responsible with your spending, that is the way you reduce the deficits, which is what the budget sets out over the forward estimates and over the medium term. See, but Lee, as you balance the budget over the years, you're bringing the deficits down as a share of the economy, and that means you're getting the budget back to a position of structural and ultimately absolute balance. Now, this is not something new. We've done this before. It took us 6 years after the Labor period in government.
Yeah, but the scale of the debt now is the earlier debt pales into comparison.
Even more important, why you actually need a government that knows how to do this. We've done it before. We've cleaned up and dealt with these sorts of situations before. Now, I don't think anyone would contend that the investments that we had to make during the pandemic were unnecessary. And that's why that debt is what it is. It saved the country, Lee. It saved jobs. It saved businesses. The ANU themselves actually increased the estimates. Some 800,000 jobs saved. The investments we made in mental health saved lives, as did the investments we made in people's physical health for COVID. Saving the country, I thought, was worth the investment, Lee.
On your plan to allow people to dip into their superannuation to buy housing, your own superannuation minister, Jane Hume, today said that it would drive housing prices up short term. What's the point of a policy that makes already insane housing prices even worse?
Well, the key thing that impacts housing prices is the supply of housing, and what Jane was referring to was in isolation when you take all of our housing policies together, in particular the downsizing policy. Now, the downsizing policy actually gets more housing stock into the market. I mean, our housing market each year, I think, is some $687 billion. This measure affects up to about 1% of it. And so the suggestion this will have any sort of significant impact here, I just don't think bears up to scrutiny. What this does is enables people to have control over their own money, to help them buy a home, so when they go into their retirement they'll be better off, and when they buy that home they'll have lower mortgage payments because they've got more of a deposit to help them get through. This is how you help people with cost of living. You let them use their own money. You don't lock it away from them where someone else is in control of it. They should be in control of it. It's theirs.
But I could read you a long list of quotes from coalition luminaries who've previously said that allowing people to access their retirement savings to buy a house is a bad idea. I'm not going to read them all because I don't want to waste time, but I've got here John Howard, Peter Costello, Malcolm Turnbull, Christopher Pyne, Matthias Cormann, Peter Dutton. Why is rating super? Why is it your break glass policy? Because you did it during COVID, you're doing it again now.
No. Well, those policies they're referring to are not the policy we've put forward here, Lee, because the policy we've put forward here is not that people take money out of their superannuation and never put it back. This policy actually invests it back into your superannuation so it doesn't impact on your long-term retirement savings. That's the difference. And what they were referring to was something quite different.
But what if the housing market tanks?
That's why this policy is
We know the
smart.
housing market's
Sorry?
What if the housing market tanks? We know the housing market, for example, is a bubble at the moment. What if it tanks?
Lee, what you're suggesting is owning your own home is a gamble Australians shouldn't take. I don't agree with that. I heard Penny Wong say that today. Owning your home is the most significant asset for most Australians that they will ever own. I know it's the case for Jenny and I. And I believe buying a home is the best economic decision that you can make. And it's the strongest thing you can do for families and communities. That's why I'm all in on the side of those who want to buy a home. And I know for the parents of those and family members of those who are looking at their family, really, this is a tough thing. And they go to them for help as well. Well, we can't just allow that to be the case. We should be allowing people to use their own money. And that's what this does. It boosts their ultimate retirement incomes because they're investing in their own home, the best investment anyone ever makes, and it ensures they can get into the housing market earlier, saving them time and reducing their ultimate mortgage payments.
Prime Minister,
it adds up at every level.
Prime Minister, you've said that this election is about one thing, jobs, and you want to create 1 million more of them. You talk to anyone at the moment in business...
1.3 million, yeah.
You talk to anyone in business at the moment, large or small, and what they'll tell you is that they can't get enough workers to fill their current vacancies. They don't want more jobs, they want more workers.
That's true. This is the single biggest challenge facing the Australian economy today.
Well, aren't you going to make the problem worse? Do you make 1 million more jobs?
No, that means the economy will be bigger and there'll be more people there to fill those jobs because we're investing in the skills of Australians. The jobs we're creating are skilled jobs. These are jobs where we currently have 220,000 Australians in trade training right now. That's the highest level we've ever seen, Lee, since 1963 when records began.
Yeah,
we've invested over $7 billion this year alone in additional training places.
Sorry to interrupt. Training takes...
Sorry, interrupt.
Training takes time, right? And people are saying that they have gaps and vacancies that they can't fill right now. So what are you going to do as a federal government to help with that?
Well, just as well then, Lee, wasn't it, that during the pandemic we did the boosting apprenticeship scheme, the commencing and the completing apprenticeship schemes. That means that we've got those 220,000 people who are doing apprentices and finishing them now. Isn't it just the exact thing we should have done with Job Trainer, which we did, a more than $1 billion program, together with the states and territories that we created over 400,000 training places, 30,000 more university places during the pandemic. We've been investing big on those skills and education because we know that's what the country needs. Now, the immigration program will begin to build back up again and it'll focus heavily on skills. The agricultural visa, the work we've done with the Pacific Labour Scheme. I was at a vineyard the other day and an orchard, and the workers there were from East Timor, from Timor-Leste, and we have workers coming in from many parts of the Pacific, which is helping with that program. They're the solutions. It's tough, there's no doubt about that, and I believe investing in skills and investing in that labour force is the most important economic challenge that we have facing our economy in the short to medium term.
On wages, if you don't support wages keeping pace with inflation, isn't what you're saying to Australians that you support them taking a pay cut? Because that's the practical effect of it.
I support the Fair Work Commission making decisions on wages, taking into account all the factors that impact on people's cost of living and whether they'll be better off. I support wage increases, Lee.
But what about my central
point
point
there? I want people to be paid more.
What about my central point there, that if your pay doesn't match, if it doesn't go up by as much as inflation, you are effectively taking a pay cut because you've got the same money but everything costs more?
Well, let me give you an example of our record on that. 7 out of the last 8 minimum wage decisions made by Fair Work ensured that the minimum wage rose faster than inflation. And real wages, since we came to government, for the minimum wage is actually lifted in real terms by 7%.
So do you accept
now, when the
then
Labor
that
Party was in...
Sorry, Prime Minister, there's a slight delay, so I do apologise that it looks like I'm interrupting you.
No,
but do you accept then,
That's all right, I understand.
Do you accept then that there is a cost of living crisis?
Well, everybody knows the war in Europe, the disruption of supply chains from the pandemic, and even the floods that we've seen that are impacting on fruit and vegetable prices. The whole world knows that there's upward pressure on inflation. I mean, inflation in Australia at 5.1%. In New Zealand, it's almost 7%. In the United States, it's 8.5%. I mean, what we're seeing in Australia is, yes, it's tough. But if you look at the performance of like countries to Australia, the economic shield that we've put in place to protect Australians from those forces and the additional things we did in this budget, whether it was halving petrol tax or additional support for pensioners or extending the tax relief and the ongoing tax relief, is there to help Australians better cope with this. The reason we did that is because we didn't want all the gains of coming through this pandemic as people get up on their feet again for them to be knocked down again. But the other point I was going to make, Lee, before there was the misunderstanding, is when Labor was in power, there were 6 decisions of minimum wages. On 3 occasions, they did not go up more than the inflation rate. So they talk a big game on this, but when they were in government, they didn't achieve what they now claim to say they can.
On climate change, do you accept that to get to net zero by 2050, Australia needs to shut down most of its coal-fired power stations by 2030?
No, I don't. No, I don't. And there will be a change that will take place in Australia around the world that will happen over time. And that's why we believe in investing in carbon capture, use and storage technologies.
So do you have a time frame in your head for when
investments do?
Do you have a time frame in your head for when you think coal will end in Australia?
Well, not specifically, because that will be decided by those who are actually using and running those power stations based on their commercial viability. And they currently have timetables on all of those. But in some cases, those timetables are brought forward, and that's why we took action, particularly to develop the gas-fired plant up there in Kurri Kurri, to ensure that we can keep reliable energy generation in the system. Because for all the renewables to work, the intermittent renewables, the ones that rely on solar and wind, they need firmed power, as it's called, or reliable power, to support them to make the whole grid work so you don't have variability problems. And so our plan does that. Our plan ensures that the transmission investments that we're putting into the grid are based on when it is needed and where it is needed. Labor's plan puts $20 billion of investment that goes beyond that, which can only force up electricity prices. So our emissions plan, which has already seen emissions fall by around 20%, far more than Canada, far more than New Zealand, more than Japan. All of these countries, we are performing better. We've got we have the highest rooftop solar rates in the world. Australians are doing it, we're doing it. We have a plan to get to net zero by 2050 based on the technologies that will not only solve the problem in Australia, but around the world, and particularly in our region, and in partner countries like Indonesia and India, where we've developed these partnerships to develop things like hydrogen technology, as well as carbon capture, use and storage. That's how you deal with climate change, a long-term technology plan.
I said earlier that for a 9-year government, there's a record of what you've instigated and there's a record of what you've had to react to. So shifting to what you've had to react to, let me read you a quote from Anthony Albanese. They always react too little, too late, whether it's the bushfire crisis, whether it's responding to victims of floods, or whether it's ordering enough vaccines. Those 3 examples are indisputable, aren't they?
They're the comments of an armchair critic who only ever had to say anything about something that had happened after it happened.
He's an armchair critic, sure. He's the opposition leader. But, Prime Minister, those 3 examples, the government was late to respond on all of them.
Well, I have to disagree on a couple of points there, Lee. Firstly, $2.9 billion straight in there to support the victims of bushfires. On floods, the same has been the case. We had people winching people off roofs within hours of floods hitting. And I think those who have been directly involved in the delivery of that support, whether it was our Centrelink officers who are there providing emergency cash assistance and getting on the ground, our Defence Force personnel,
but Prime Minister, everyone's
the
seen
HMAS Adelaide that went to
the people. You can't honestly say that there was enough on the ground
I'm aware
at the
of
time.
the narrative. Well, it was a massive crisis, Lee. I mean, there are not Defence Force personnel sitting in every single town in the country.
No, but
that's not how it works.
We did, Prime Minister,
people moved as.
Sorry, we did have that Royal Commission after the bushfires, and Australians were assured that we'd never see a situation. We were assured we'd never see a situation again where people were left in such dire need. And then we had those floods in New South Wales this year. Is that the kind of performance that deserves another 3 years?
Well, That is not what the Royal Commission found, Lee. I commissioned the Royal Commission, and the government, state and federal and local for that matter, moved as swiftly and as promptly as we possibly could in a flood that was without precedent in this country, estimates of some 500 years. But on the vaccine program, you've mentioned that. We took decisions in August of 2020 to ensure that we manufactured vaccines in Australia. Now, we had challenges in the early phase of the vaccine rollout. I've openly admitted that. But, you know, what happens when you have challenges and setbacks in a pandemic? You don't get everything right, and where it isn't going to plan, you change the plan, you get back on top of it. General Fulham was appointed, the vaccine program was turned around, we were able to get access to the vaccines and the deals I was able to do with Poland and the United Kingdom and others, and we ended up having one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. My point is, it's easy to make criticisms, Lee, in the middle of a pandemic after the event. But when you're there taking the country through all of that and the decisions that have to be made every single day, when you step back and you look at what Australians have been able to achieve over these last 2 years, I think fair-minded people will see that Australia is compared very well to other countries. And it didn't happen by accident. We did it all together.
On foreign policy, the government was apparently blindsided by the China Solomon Islands security deal. And your reaction was to say that China attempting to build a naval base there would be a red line and that you wouldn't allow it. What does that mean? How would you not allow this red line to be crossed?
Well, let me take you back. The Australian government was not blindsided. We were aware of the efforts being made by the Chinese government to do exactly that.
But
and
if
we've
you can
been
address
taking
the
action.
question,
Well, you said we'd been blindsided, Lee, and I'm just saying that actually wasn't the case, and I said that at the time because, I mean, this is a very serious issue, and it is one we'd been working on and working with the family of nations in the Pacific since before I became the Prime Minister, but I took it to a whole nother level.
So
I mean,
how are
after
you
the last
enforcing this
election,
red line?
the first place I went to was the Solomon Islands.
So
and
what
one
about
of the
this
things
red
we've
line?
had to change with... Lee, I'm trying to answer the question. The way you deal with countries in the Pacific had to change. Australia had a reputation of stomping around and treating the Pacific like they were some sort of colonial outpost. That was the feedback that I was getting from leaders when I became Prime Minister.
And this red
and
line?
I've sought to turn that around. And frankly, in relation to where Prime Minister Sogavare is, I mean, he is talking about his engagement with Australia over a very long time. And so in terms of red lines, well, we're making it very clear that that is not a situation that we think is in the Solomon Islands' interest,
Yeah, but you said
in the
you
broader
wouldn't allow
Pacific's
it
interest,
to be
or
crossed.
Australia's.
What does it
and
mean?
the United States have said the same thing.
Yeah, but what does it
and
mean?
so we will work constructively with our partners to ensure that that never occurs. But I'm not going to speculate on those actions, Lee. I don't think that would be a wise thing to do. But governments and countries have to be very clear about what we understand to be acceptable and unacceptable circumstances, both in the regional security interests and the national security interests. And we'll work with partners to avoid that outcome. And the Prime Minister has already made it very clear in the Solomon Islands that a naval base is not something that he would support, or indeed the people of the Solomon Islands would support.
I'm curious for your insights. Why do you think that previously blue ribbon Liberal seats, the kind that usually barely warrant a glance during an election campaign, are vulnerable to independence?
Well, I'd simply say that supporting independence in those seats will only produce a parliament of chaos.
No, that's not the question.
And
The
a
question
parliament
is
of
why do you
chaos.
think they're vulnerable for the first time?
Well, I'd say that our members have done an extraordinary job there, but as time has gone on, many of these places, I suppose, are less vulnerable to the impacts of the economy than, say, many of the places I've been in this campaign. Where I was today, up there in the seat of Blair and out in parts of regional Australia and the broader suburbs of the country. I mean, they are places that cannot afford the sort of risk that comes with a Labor Party and a leader that just is a bit loose on the economy. They will pay the price for that. And I think it's important that perhaps some parts of our country may feel they're a bit more insulated from the impacts of that and maybe focusing on other issues. But I do know this, you can't address climate change and invest in the technology you need to deal with climate change unless you have a strong economy. You can't invest in mental health support or dealing with the issues involving violence against women and put $2.5 billion into those programs, or develop advanced manufacturing, or ensure that the pharmaceutical benefit scheme can have 2,900 new or amended listings on it. You can't do that without a strong economy. And you can never take that for granted, and that's the point I'd make in those seats. Do not take our strong economy for granted, and please do not give us a parliament that would be one of chaos that would only weaken Australia and make it harder for Australians.
Looking ahead to Sunday, if the coalition has lost, can we take it as a given that you'll be standing down as leader?
Oh, Lee, I don't speculate on things like that.
Oh, come on, it's in a few days' time. You must be thinking about it.
The only person who's announced their retirement is you, Lee, and I wish you very well in your retirement.
No,
and I commend you on the great job you've done over a long time.
No, but Prime Minister,
You've
come on.
interviewed me probably more than anyone else.
Come on, you must be...
I think over the course of my career.
I'm sure that's right, but you must be Prime Minister thinking about what happens if you lose. Can we take it as a given that you would be standing down in that scenario? No, we can't take it as given. That is not something I'm contemplating, because I'm not contemplating on that being the scenario. OK, what if there was a hung parliament, Prime Minister? Sorry, can I just... Prime Minister...
I'm not getting into the scenario games, Lee, because right now I'm focused on one thing. I'm focused on one thing, and that's ensuring that our government continues, because we have the economic plan that we've demonstrated the economic credibility with over these last very difficult years, to ensure we secure the opportunities in the future.
Yes, but if you want that government to continue, if you want that government to continue, let's say...
Then we need to win the majority of seats at this election.
Well, exactly, and what that might involve in the